The storm rolled in faster than Evelyn Hayes had anticipated. Thick, churning clouds spilled across the horizon, their dark underbellies flashing with lightning. Rain lashed against the windshield of her old RV as she maneuvered it into the parking lot of a nearly deserted truck stop. The neon sign above the diner flickered, half of it working, the other half stubbornly dark. She killed the engine and exhaled deeply, her breath fogging the glass. This wasn't where she planned to stop for the night. But with the storm intensifying and her arthritis flaring in her hands, continuing on was out of the question. She reached into her glove compartment and pulled out a small tin containing her military medals. Evelyn opened it carefully, her calloused fingers brushing against the cool metal of a bronze star. She wasn't sentimental, but this little ritual, looking at the medals before bed, helped her stay grounded. She was 80 now, a far cry from the sharp-eyed soldier who'd earned these decorations decades ago. Gathering her coat and bag, Evelyn braced herself for the rain and stepped out of the RV. The wind whipped her silver hair against her face, but she trudged forward toward the warm glow of the diner. She didn't notice the 2 motorcycles parked near the far end of the lot, or the 2 men leaning against them, watching her every move. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. A young waitress wiped down the counter while an older man in a trucker hat sipped coffee in a corner booth. Evelyn took a seat near the window, her back instinctively to the wall. Old habits died hard. She ordered coffee and a slice of pie, grateful for the warmth of the diner after the chill outside. As she sipped her coffee, the door jingled. 2 men entered, both dressed in leather jackets adorned with patches. They were younger, maybe in their 30s, with an air of menace that made the waitress hesitate before greeting them. Evelyn watched them out of the corner of her eye. They scanned the room, their eyes landing on her. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, nudged his companion and whispered something. They both smirked. Evelyn's instincts prickled. She didn't like their look, the way they moved with a swagger that screamed trouble. She returned her attention to her pie, pretending not to notice as they approached. "Well, well," the scarred man said, pulling out the chair across from her without asking. "What's a sweet old lady like you doing out here all alone?" Evelyn didn't flinch. She set her fork down deliberately and met his gaze. "Just passing through," she said coolly. His companion chuckled, leaning against the booth. "Passing through? Huh? Storm like this, you might want to stick around. Never know what could happen out on the road." Evelyn's grip tightened on her coffee mug, but she kept her face neutral. "Thanks for the concern, but I'll manage." The scarred man leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You got family waiting for you, Grandma? Or are you all by your lonesome?" The implication in his tone was clear, and Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. She glanced around the diner. The waitress had retreated to the kitchen, and the trucker in the corner was staring intently at his coffee, pretending not to notice the exchange. She straightened her posture, letting a hint of steel creep into her voice. "You boys seem real interested in my business. Care to share yours?" The scarred man grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just being friendly. People don't talk much about respect these days, do they?" Evelyn didn't answer. She'd seen men like this before, bullies who thought intimidation was power. She glanced at their jackets, noting the patches, a snarling wolf's head and a name stitched in crimson thread, Blood Vultures. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle by the time Evelyn returned to her RV. The bikers were gone, at least for the moment, but their laughter echoed in her mind. She locked the door behind her and double-checked the windows, a habit ingrained from years of vigilance. Sinking into the worn seat by the small kitchenette, Evelyn let out a slow breath. She didn't feel fear exactly. She had faced far worse in her life, but unease curled in her chest. Her thoughts drifted back to a time when she'd been anything but vulnerable. It was 1964, and Evelyn was 20 years old, standing on the tarmac at Fort Bragg. The air was thick with heat and tension as her unit prepared for deployment. She was part of the Strategic Allied Intelligence, SAI, a division known for handling covert operations in hostile territories. They were trained to be ghosts, slipping in and out of danger zones without a trace. Evelyn had been one of the first women to join the SAI, and she'd worked twice as hard to prove herself. Back then, she was lean and wiry, her blonde hair always tied in a no-nonsense bun beneath her cap. She remembered the skepticism in her commanding officer's eyes when she first walked into the barracks. "You think you're ready for this, Hayes?" he'd asked, holding her gaze. "Yes, sir," she'd replied without hesitation. She'd earned his respect on her first mission, extracting an injured operative from enemy territory under heavy fire. It wasn't courage that drove her. It was duty. Evelyn had always believed in the mission, in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. But war had a way of leaving scars that didn't always show. She'd lost comrades, made impossible choices, and seen things she never talked about. Even now, decades later, the memories crept in during quiet moments, uninvited but relentless. Evelyn reached for the photo, taped to the wall above her kitchenette. It was old and faded, the edges curled from years of handling. The picture showed her and her unit, a ragtag group of men and women in fatigues, smiling despite the danger that surrounded them. Beside her stood Captain Morris, her closest friend and the one person who truly understood what the war had taken from her. Morris had been her rock during those years, always the first to crack a joke in the darkest moments. But he'd been the one who didn't make it back. Evelyn still remembered the sound of the explosion, the dust settling, and the deafening silence that followed. She closed her eyes and let the memory fade, grounding herself in the present. Her RV was her sanctuary now, a small but sufficient home on wheels. It carried her across the country, allowing her to visit old battlegrounds, memorials, and the graves of her fallen comrades. That was her mission now, to remember, to honor, and to keep moving. But tonight, those bikers had disrupted her peace. Evelyn wasn't naive. She'd seen men like them before. Predators, sniffing out weakness, mistaking age for fragility. She glanced at her duffel bag stowed under the bed. Inside were the tools of her trade: a map of her planned route, a first aid kit, a hunting knife, and a small handgun she carried for protection. Evelyn had learned long ago that preparation was the key to survival. As she unpacked her thoughts, her mind drifted to the young trucker from the diner. His concern had been genuine, though she wasn't used to relying on anyone but herself. Evelyn had always been self-sufficient. After her husband passed away 10 years ago, and her children moved to different states, she'd embraced solitude. It wasn't loneliness, she told herself. It was independence. Yet tonight, for the first time in a while, she felt the weight of being alone. She pulled out her notebook, flipping to a page where she'd written down the names of fallen comrades. It was her ritual before bed, to say their names aloud, a private act of remembrance. Captain Morris, Sergeant Calloway, Private Jensen. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, the names carrying years of love and loss. As she closed the notebook, a low growl of an engine caught her attention. Evelyn stiffened, her senses sharp. Rising from her seat, she peeked through the curtain. 2 motorcycles rolled slowly into the lot, their headlights cutting through the rain. It was them. The bikers idled for a moment before circling her RV like vultures. One of them pointed at the vehicle, laughing. Evelyn's jaw tightened. This wasn't a coincidence. They were testing her, trying to intimidate her. But she wasn't the type to back down. She reached for the duffel bag and pulled out her hunting knife. It wasn't time for a confrontation yet, but if they pushed her, Evelyn Hayes was ready to show them exactly who they were dealing with. The bikers revved their engines and sped off into the night, their taillights disappearing into the darkness. Evelyn watched until the sound faded completely. Returning to her seat, she set the knife on the table and stared at it for a long moment. She whispered to herself, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "You've faced worse than this. Stay sharp." Evelyn didn't know what the bikers wanted, but she had a feeling she'd find out soon enough. For now, she prepared herself, mentally and physically, for whatever was coming next. The night stretched long and uneasy. Evelyn lay on the narrow bed in her RV, the knife resting within arm's reach on the counter. She stared at the ceiling, her mind churning through possibilities. She couldn't let herself be careless. Rain tapped softly against the windows, the storm losing its edge. Evelyn let the rhythmic sound calm her nerves. Sleep threatened to overtake her when a sudden noise jolted her upright. A sharp metallic clink followed by a faint, scraping sound outside. She was on her feet in an instant, her instinct sharp. She grabbed the knife and approached the window quietly. Pulling the curtain aside just enough to see out, she scanned the area. A shadow moved near the back of the RV. Her grip on the knife tightened. She didn't panic. Years of training had taught her that fear clouded judgment. Silently, she moved to the other side of the RV, grabbing a flashlight from a drawer. The scraping sound came again, this time louder, accompanied by low murmurs. There were at least two voices. Evelyn clicked off the interior lights, plunging the RV into darkness, and slipped to the door. With one hand on the handle and the knife in the other, she eased the door open just enough to peer outside. The taller biker, the one with the scar, was fiddling with something on her rear tire. His companion stood watch, glancing around nervously. "You sure this is a good idea?" the second man whispered. "Relax," Scarred Man replied, his voice a sneer. "Just a little message. Let her think twice about mouthing off." Evelyn's stomach churned with anger, but she forced herself to remain still. She watched as Scarred Man produced a blade, running it along the rubber of her tire with deliberate malice. They weren't just intimidating her. They were sabotaging her escape. Evelyn's mind raced. She could confront them now, but that might escalate things too quickly. Instead, she eased the door shut and crept toward the back of the RV. She pulled open a small compartment containing an old wrench, heavy enough to make a point without being lethal. She slipped outside, her movements as silent as a shadow, and circled around the RV, keeping low. The rain muffled her steps as she approached from behind. Scarred Man knelt beside the tire, his knife poised to strike. Evelyn didn't hesitate. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, landing squarely on him. "That's far enough," Evelyn said, her voice sharp and commanding. The bikers froze, their heads snapping toward her. Scarred Man squinted into the light, then sneered. "Well, look who's awake," he said, rising slowly. "Just checking your tires, Grandma. They seemed a little low." Evelyn stepped forward, her knife glinting in the flashlight's beam. "I don't need your help," she said coldly. "And if I see either of you near my vehicle again, you'll regret it." The second biker took a step back, glancing nervously at his companion. "Come on, man. She's not worth it." Scarred Man didn't move. His smirk faded, replaced by something darker. "You've got some nerve, lady. You think you can talk to me like that?" Evelyn didn't flinch. She raised the wrench slightly, her posture calm but firm. "I think you've underestimated me. That's your first mistake. You want to make another?" The tension crackled between them like a live wire. For a moment, Scarred Man looked like he might charge her. Then he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, tucking his knife away. "But you'll learn. Everybody learns eventually." He jerked his head toward his companion, and the two of them backed away toward their bikes. "This isn't over," Scarred Man called over his shoulder as they mounted their motorcycles. Evelyn stood her ground, watching as they sped off into the night. Only when the sound of their engines faded completely did she lower the wrench. Her hands shook slightly as the adrenaline began to ebb, but she forced herself to breathe deeply. She inspected the tire they'd been tampering with and found a shallow cut, deep enough to deflate it by morning but not beyond repair. Returning to the RV, Evelyn locked the door and slid into the driver's seat. She started the engine, the low rumble steady and reassuring. She couldn't stay here any longer. It was too risky. Evelyn checked her map, deciding to head toward the next town, 40 miles away. She'd stop at a 24-hour gas station and patch up the tire there. As she pulled out of the lot, her mind was already working on a plan. She needed to understand who these bikers were and what they wanted. She wouldn't let them push her into a corner. She'd faced bigger threats before and come out on top. Tonight had been a warning, but Evelyn Hayes wasn't one to back down. This wasn't over, but the bikers had made one critical error. They'd underestimated their target. The long stretch of highway shimmered under the rain, the occasional streetlight casting pale beams over the road. Evelyn's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as her RV cut through the darkness. The adrenaline from her confrontation with the bikers hadn't faded entirely, leaving her both alert and restless. Her military training urged her to assess the situation logically. Who were these bikers? What did they want? And why her? The blood vultures patch on their jackets had stirred a faint memory, though she couldn't place it yet. Motorcycle gangs weren't uncommon in small towns and truck stops, but this group had a deliberate cruelty in their approach. Evelyn had encountered men like them before, ones who thrived on fear and control. A flicker of headlights appeared in her side mirror. Evelyn tensed, her eyes darting to the reflective glass. A pair of motorcycles was following her, their engines a faint rumble in the distance. She checked her speed, making sure she wasn't doing anything to draw attention. The bikes stayed back, trailing her like predators biding their time. 40 miles to the next town, she reminded herself. Stay steady. Stay sharp. The road was too narrow and winding for her to pull over safely. If they wanted to force her to stop, she'd have to make it as difficult as possible. As the miles ticked by, Evelyn spotted a faint glow on the horizon, the lights of a small gas station. She eased off the accelerator slightly, letting her pursuers think she was preparing to stop. When she was close enough, she swung into the station abruptly, pulling up to the pump nearest the building. The bikers followed, parking their motorcycles a few yards away. Evelyn noted their positioning immediately. One dismounted, lingering by the entrance, while the other stayed on his bike, engine idling. Evelyn stepped out of the RV, the cold air biting against her skin. She kept her movements measured, her hunting knife tucked discreetly into her jacket pocket. The gas station attendant, a wiry man in his 50s, leaned out from behind the counter as she approached. His name tag read Glenn, and his expression shifted from bored to wary as he noticed the bikers. "Evening," Evelyn said, her tone neutral. "Mind if I use the air pump? Got a tire that needs patching." Glenn nodded, his gaze flicking between her and the bikers. "Help yourself. Air's free." "Thanks." As she worked on the tire, the biker near the entrance sauntered closer. He was lean, with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck. His grin was casual, but his eyes held a predatory gleam. "Looks like you had some bad luck, ma'am," he drawled, his voice dripping with false concern. Evelyn didn't look up. "Just a nail on the road. Nothing I can't handle." The biker chuckled. "You sure about that? Seems like you're having a rough night. Maybe we can help." She tightened the seal on the patch and stood, wiping her hands on a rag. "Appreciate the offer, but I'm good." The other biker revved his engine, a low growl that echoed across the lot. Snake Tattoo leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "See, here's the thing, lady. My friend and I, we don't like being disrespected. And you? You've been giving us some attitude tonight." Evelyn met his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said evenly, "but I don't take kindly to people tampering with my vehicle." Snake Tattoo's grin faltered, replaced by a sneer. He opened his mouth to respond, but Glenn's voice cut through the tension. "Hey!" the attendant barked, stepping out from behind the counter. He held a hefty flashlight in one hand, and his stance suggested he knew how to swing it. "You boys need something, or are you just loitering?" Snake Tattoo turned to glare at Glenn, his bravado faltering. "Just talking," he muttered. "Well, talk somewhere else," Glenn said firmly. "This ain't your hangout." The second biker grumbled something under his breath before revving his engine again. Snake Tattoo threw Evelyn one last look, half warning, half promise, before retreating to his bike. As they sped off into the night, Evelyn let out a slow breath. Glenn crossed his arms, studying her. "You okay, ma'am?" "I've been through worse," she replied, managing a small smile. "Those guys been bothering you long?" "Long enough," Evelyn said. She hesitated before adding, "You know them?" Glenn nodded grimly. "Blood vultures. Small-time gang, mostly petty theft and intimidation, but they've been getting bolder lately. Guess they think they own this stretch of highway." Evelyn frowned, filing the information away. "They're not going to let this go, are they?" "Probably not," Glenn admitted. "But you held your own back there. That'll rattle them some." She appreciated the vote of confidence, though she wasn't so sure. "Thanks for stepping in." Glenn shrugged. "Not about to stand by and watch them harass someone on my lot. You need anything else before you go?" Evelyn considered her options. "Got a phone I can use?" "Mine's dead." "Inside. Help yourself." As she made the call, reporting the bikers' harassment to the local sheriff, Evelyn felt a renewed sense of purpose. These men were dangerous, But she wasn't about to let them dictate her next move. She had been tested before, and she'd come out stronger every time. The bikers thought she was just an old woman traveling alone. They had no idea what they were dealing with. The gas station's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the empty aisles as Evelyn hung up the phone. The local sheriff's department had promised to send a deputy out to patrol the area, but she could tell from the dispatcher's tone that they weren't treating her call as urgent. Evelyn wasn't surprised. It was a small-town department, likely spread thin, and a couple of bikers harassing a traveler probably didn't rank high on their list of priorities. She couldn't afford to rely on them entirely. Glenn stood behind the counter, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Everything okay?" She nodded. "Deputy's on the way, but I'm not holding my breath." He snorted. "Smart. Out here, you're better off looking out for yourself." "That's the plan," Evelyn replied, heading back outside. The RV sat parked under the gas station's lone security camera, her patched tire holding steady. She double-checked her supplies, fuel, food, and water, then reached for a small, locked compartment beneath the driver's seat. Inside was a black pouch containing a Glock 19 and 2 spare magazines. Evelyn paused for a moment, her hand resting on the weapon. She hadn't fired it in years, but its weight was reassuring. After everything that had happened tonight, she wasn't taking any chances. As she slid the gun into her jacket's inner pocket, Glenn appeared in the doorway. "If you're thinking about heading out, I'd keep an eye on your rear view. Those guys don't let things go easy." "I figured as much," Evelyn said, climbing into the driver's seat. "But I've handled worse." Glenn hesitated, then leaned against the doorframe. "Listen, if you're planning to stick around town for a bit, there's a diner a couple miles up the road. Ruby's Place. Good coffee, decent people. Cops stop by there a lot, too. Might be a safer spot to lay low." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "You seem awfully invested in helping me out." He shrugged. "Those blood vultures? They've been bad news for months. You standing up to them might be just the wake-up call this town needs." Evelyn studied him for a moment before offering a small smile. "Thanks for the tip, Glenn." She started the RV and pulled back onto the highway, the rain now reduced to a light drizzle. The drive to Ruby's Place was short, but Evelyn stayed vigilant, scanning her mirrors for any sign of the bikers. The diner came into view, its neon sign flickering against the dark sky. It was a modest building with a few cars parked outside. A sheriff's cruiser was stationed near the entrance, a welcome sight. Evelyn parked and stepped inside, the scent of coffee and fried food hitting her instantly. The diner was warm and inviting, with red vinyl booths and a jukebox softly playing a tune from decades past. A waitress in her 30s approached, her name tag reading Lisa. "Take any seat you like, hon," she said with a friendly smile. Evelyn chose a booth near the back, her eyes instinctively scanning the room. A couple of truckers sat at the counter, chatting with Lisa as she poured their coffee. The deputy from the cruiser, a young man with a buzz cut, was hunched over a plate of pancakes. As Evelyn sipped her coffee, she replayed the events of the night in her mind. The bikers weren't random thugs. Their deliberate actions suggested they had a plan. But why target her? Her thoughts were interrupted when the deputy approached her table, a cautious but curious expression on his face. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat slightly, "I'm Deputy Miller. Glenn radioed in about your run-in with the blood vultures. Everything okay now?" "For the moment," Evelyn replied. "But they're persistent. You might want to keep an eye out." Miller nodded, sliding into the seat across from her. "They've been stirring up trouble lately, petty theft, vandalism, a few bar fights. Nothing major, but they're getting bolder. Any idea why they came after you?" Evelyn considered his question carefully. "Could be random, but something tells me it's more than that. I didn't back down, and they didn't like that." Miller frowned, rubbing the back of his neck. "They're used to people rolling over. If you stood up to them, they'll see it as a challenge." "Good," Evelyn said flatly. The deputy blinked, surprised by her response. "You're not from around here, are you?" "No," she said, her tone clipped. Before Miller could press further, the diner door swung open. A burly man in a leather vest and a blood vulture's patch stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. Evelyn tensed immediately, her hand moving toward her pocket. Miller turned in his seat, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered gun. "Trouble?" he asked softly. "Not yet," Evelyn replied, watching as the biker spotted her and grinned. He approached the booth slowly, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Relax, lady. I just came to talk." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "You've got about 10 seconds before I change my mind." The biker chuckled, glancing at Miller. "No need for the dramatics. Just delivering a message." "Then deliver it and leave," Miller said firmly. The biker's grin widened, but there was no humor in it. "The boss doesn't like loose ends. Says you'd better keep driving and not look back. Otherwise," he trailed off, his meaning clear. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice cold and steady. "Tell your boss this. I don't scare easy. And if he wants to make this personal, he'd better be ready for the consequences." The biker's grin faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Suit yourself," he said, backing away. "Don't say I didn't warn you." As he left, Miller turned back to Evelyn, his expression grim. "You've got guts, ma'am, but these guys don't play fair." "Neither do I," Evelyn said, her eyes hard. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. The blood vultures had drawn a line in the sand, and Evelyn Hayes wasn't about to back down. The air inside Ruby's place was heavy with tension after the biker's departure. Evelyn's calm facade masked the calculating storm inside her mind. She had dealt with bullies before, both in uniform and out of it, but the blood vultures' growing audacity made it clear they were more than just a nuisance. They were a threat she could no longer ignore. Deputy Miller lingered by her booth, his concern evident. "Ma'am, I appreciate your courage, but you're poking a hornet's nest. These guys don't back down, and they've got numbers on their side." Evelyn sipped her coffee, unbothered by his warning. "I've faced worse odds." Miller shook his head. "Look, I'll be straight with you. Our department doesn't have the manpower to handle a full-on gang war. If this escalates, you'll be on your own." "That's fine," Evelyn said firmly, her eyes locking onto his. "I'm not asking for backup." Miller frowned, clearly conflicted. Before he could argue further, Lisa approached with a fresh pot of coffee. "Top you off?" she asked, her tone attempting to lighten the mood. Evelyn nodded. "Thanks." Lisa poured the coffee, her eyes darting between Evelyn and Miller. "Those bikers have been stirring up trouble all over town. Someone needs to teach them a lesson." Evelyn smirked. "I'm working on it." Lisa hesitated before adding, "You know, you're not the first person they've tried to scare off. There was a guy last month, truck driver passing through. They roughed him up pretty bad." Miller nodded grimly. "He pressed charges, but they've got good lawyers." "The case went nowhere." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Sounds like they've been running this game for a while." Lisa leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "If you're planning to fight back, you might want to talk to Rick. He owns the hardware store down the road. Lost a nephew to those thugs a year ago. He's been itching for payback ever since." Evelyn filed the information away. "Thanks for the tip." She finished her coffee and left a generous tip on the table before heading out. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and shining under the streetlights. As she climbed into her RV, Deputy Miller appeared by her window. "Ma'am, if you're set on staying, at least let me give you my number. You get into trouble, call me. I'll do what I can." Evelyn took the offered card, appreciating the gesture. "Thanks, Deputy." He hesitated, then added, "Be careful. These guys don't fight fair." Evelyn watched him walk back to his cruiser before starting her engine. She had no intention of fighting fair either. The hardware store was closed by the time Evelyn arrived, but a light was on inside. She knocked on the door, her sharp raps echoing through the quiet night. After a moment, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair appeared, his expression wary. He opened the door a crack, studying her. "We're closed." "Lisa sent me," Evelyn said, cutting straight to the point. "Said you might be interested in taking a stand against the blood vultures." Rick's expression shifted from suspicion to curiosity. He opened the door wider, gesturing for her to come in. The store was cluttered but orderly, shelves lined with tools, supplies, and various odds and ends. Rick led her to a small office in the back, where he poured himself a cup of coffee and offered her one. "Lisa said that, huh?" Rick asked, his voice gruff. Evelyn nodded. She mentioned your nephew. I'm sorry for your loss. Rick's grip on his mug tightened. Danny was a good kid. Fresh out of trade school, had his whole life ahead of him. Then those bastards ran him off the road for sport. Sheriff's office couldn't do a damn thing. Evelyn leaned forward. I've had my own run-in with them tonight. They don't scare me, but I can't take them on alone. I need allies. Rick studied her, his eyes narrowing. You military? Once, Evelyn replied. Army. Retired now. He nodded approvingly. You're the real deal then. Not just some angry passerby. Evelyn smirked. I'm definitely angry, but I also know how to fight. Rick considered her for a moment longer, then stood. He opened a cabinet and pulled out a battered metal case. Inside was a shotgun and a box of shells. I've been waiting for someone to stand up to those scumbags, he said, loading the weapon. Count me in. By the time Evelyn left the hardware store, she had more than just Rick's support. He had given her a map of the area, marking key locations where the blood vultures were known to operate. She now had a clearer picture of their movements and a starting point for her counteroffensive. Back in her RV, Evelyn spread the map across the table. The gang's main hideout was an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a maze of dirt roads and dense forest. It was a tactical nightmare, but also an opportunity. If she could isolate them, she could level the playing field. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a motorcycle engine roaring past. Evelyn peeked through the curtains, spotting a lone rider circling the diner before speeding off into the night. They're watching me, she realized. Good. Let them. This wasn't just about survival anymore. The blood vultures had made it personal. Evelyn Hayes wasn't just going to stand her ground. She was going to end this. The dawn broke over the sleepy town, casting a pale golden glow on its worn buildings and empty streets. Evelyn's RV was parked in the lot outside the diner, her resolve solidified after a long night of planning. She had marked the gang's known haunts on Rick's map and developed a strategy for dismantling their operations piece by piece. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. As the morning crowd trickled into Ruby's place for coffee and breakfast, Evelyn observed them carefully. Farmers, truckers, small business owners, ordinary people with extraordinary resilience. These were the kind of folks who'd been trampled by the blood vultures for too long. Evelyn rose from her booth and approached the counter, where Lisa was pouring coffee. Lisa, I need a favor. Lisa raised an eyebrow. What kind of favor? I need to talk to the people here, Evelyn said, gesturing to the diners. All of them. Lisa hesitated, then nodded. All right, but keep it civil. We don't need anyone flipping tables. Evelyn smirked. I'll behave. Lisa clinked a spoon against a mug, gaining everyone's attention. Folks, this here's Evelyn. She's got something to say. The chatter died down as the patrons turned to face her. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. I know some of you saw what happened last night, she began. Those bikers, the blood vultures, they're not just a nuisance. They're predators. They've been terrorizing this town, and it's time we did something about it. A murmur spread through the room. One of the truckers, a wiry man in a flannel shirt, spoke up. Lady, we've all tried. Cops don't do squat, and anyone who pushes back ends up worse off. Evelyn nodded. I've heard the stories. I'm not here to put anyone in danger, but I'm also not backing down. These guys aren't invincible. They rely on fear to keep us quiet, but fear only works if we let it. Another voice chimed in, this time from an older man with a weathered face. And what's your plan? You gonna take him all on by yourself? I'm asking for help, Evelyn admitted. Not to fight, but to stand together. Share what you know about their movements, their patterns. Help me hit them where it hurts. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Finally, Rick entered, his shotgun slung over his shoulder. She's right, he said, his voice gruff. They've taken too much from this town. We've got a chance to fight back. I say we take it. The trucker glanced at Rick, then at Evelyn. You think this'll actually work? Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. I don't think, I know, but only if we stand together. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Evelyn, with Rick's help, gathered intelligence from the townspeople. Truckers shared routes where the bikers frequently ambushed vehicles. A retired mechanic offered insights into the gang's bikes and their vulnerabilities. A farmer mentioned seeing a convoy of bikers heading to the abandoned factory at odd hours. Each piece of information added to Evelyn's growing strategy. Deputy Miller arrived midway through the planning, clearly torn between his duty and his concern for the town's safety. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said, leaning against the counter. Evelyn crossed her arms. "It's not a game. It's survival." "And what happens when the blood vultures retaliate?" Miller asked. "They already did," Evelyn replied. "Now it's our turn." Miller sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I can't officially condone this, but I'm not blind. These people need hope, and it's clear you're giving them that. Just be careful." As the day progressed, word spread quickly about Evelyn's plan. By late afternoon, a small crowd had gathered in the parking lot of Ruby's place, discussing how they could contribute. The mood was a mix of cautious optimism and simmering anger. That optimism was shattered when the roar of motorcycle engines filled the air. A group of 5 bikers, all wearing Blood Vultures patches, pulled into the lot. Their leader, a towering man with a jagged scar across his cheek, dismounted and strode toward the crowd. "Look at this," he sneered. "A little town meeting. What's the occasion?" The crowd fell silent, fear rippling through them. Evelyn stepped forward, placing herself between the bikers and the townspeople. "We're done being your victims," she said coldly. The scarred man chuckled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Is that so? You must be the tough gal everyone's talking about. Let me guess, you think you can take us down?" Evelyn didn't flinch. "I don't think. I know." His grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of anger. "You've got guts, lady. I'll give you that. But guts won't save you when we come back with the whole crew." Evelyn's voice was steady, almost calm. "Then you'd better bring them all. Because when you do, you'll see just how prepared we are." The challenge hung in the air like a thundercloud. The scarred man studied her for a moment, then turned to his gang. "Let's go. We'll deal with her in this town soon enough." As the bikers roared off, Evelyn turned to the crowd. "They're coming," she said, her voice resolute. "But we'll be ready." The townspeople dispersed, energized by Evelyn's determination. Plans were made to reinforce key locations, set up lookouts, and establish communication lines. Rick offered his hardware store as a supply hub, while others volunteered tools, materials, and manpower. Evelyn worked late into the night, preparing traps and barricades with Rick and a few others. She knew the blood vultures would return, and when they did, they'd be expecting an easy victory. But this time, they'd find a town united and a soldier who refused to back down. Evelyn wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all of them. The morning dawned crisp and clear, a deceptive contrast to the growing tension in the town. Evelyn stood outside her RV, surveying the preparations underway. Townsfolk moved with purpose, transforming Ruby's place and the surrounding area into a makeshift stronghold. Rick's hardware store had become the center of activity. Tools and supplies were distributed to reinforce barricades and assemble rudimentary traps. The farmers had donated chains and fencing materials, while truckers brought surplus cargo straps and steel bars. Evelyn's focus was on strategy. She'd spent the early hours poring over maps with Rick and Deputy Miller, pinpointing weak points and escape routes. The blood vultures had numbers and speed, but Evelyn knew terrain and tactics could neutralize those advantages. Deputy Miller approached, his patrol car rumbling into the lot. He stepped out, his face lined with worry. "I've got updates," he said, holding up a tablet. Evelyn motioned for him to follow her inside Ruby's place, where a group of locals was gathered. Miller connected to a local surveillance feed, showing a series of grainy images. "These were taken late last night," he said. "The bikers are mobilizing. They've gathered at the factory on the edge of town. Estimates put them at about 20 strong, but they've likely got reinforcements coming." The room fell silent. For a town this small, 20 armed and aggressive bikers was a formidable threat. Rick leaned over the table, pointing to the map. "If they come in from the east, they'll hit the diner first. But if we can funnel them through here," he tapped a narrow dirt road leading into the heart of town, "we can slow them down." Evelyn nodded. "Good. We'll set traps along that route, barriers to force them off their bikes, then funnel them where we want them. Lisa, standing nearby, crossed her arms. What about the rest of us? Not everyone here can fight. Evelyn turned to her. Those who can't fight will help fortify safe zones. The diner's basement is solid. We'll use it as a shelter. But anyone willing to help can monitor communications or spot for us. Deputy Miller sighed. I still think this is insane, but I've got extra radios in the cruiser. You'll need them to coordinate. Evelyn gave him a small nod of gratitude. Thank you. By midday, Evelyn stood before a group of volunteers, her posture commanding but approachable. These weren't soldiers, but farmers, mechanics, truckers, people who had grown tired of living in fear. We've all lost something to the blood vultures, she began, her voice steady. A loved one, a livelihood, or our peace of mind. But today, we take it back. She looked around, meeting their gazes one by one. This fight won't be easy, and it won't be clean. But together, we can show them that this town isn't theirs to terrorize. We don't need to beat them all. We just need to send a message they'll never forget. Rick stepped forward, his shotgun slung over his shoulder. They took my nephew. I've been waiting for this day. Let's make it count. The group murmured in agreement, the fear in their eyes slowly giving way to determination. Evelyn continued, outlining the plan. We'll set traps along their approach and create choke points. Our goal is to disable as many bikes as possible. If they lose their speed, they lose their advantage. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. But remember this, we're not looking for a war. If they retreat, let them. The goal is to protect our town, not burn it down. The group nodded, their resolve solidifying. The afternoon was a blur of activity. Evelyn worked alongside the volunteers, directing the placement of barriers and traps. Chains were strung across narrow paths to force the bikers off-road, where hidden spike strips awaited. Truckers used their rigs to block major entry points, creating a labyrinth of obstacles the bikers would have to navigate. Farmers donated hay bales and heavy equipment to fortify defensive positions. Rick and a few others set up a lookout point on the roof of Ruby's place, armed with binoculars and radios. Lisa and a group of townspeople prepared the diner's basement, stocking it with food, water, and first aid supplies. Evelyn took a moment to inspect the preparations. The town wasn't a fortress, but it was ready. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, Evelyn stepped away from the bustle. She climbed onto the roof of her RV and sat quietly, watching the town below. Her thoughts drifted to her past, to the battles she'd fought and the friends she'd lost. This wasn't the battlefield she was trained for, but the stakes felt just as high. These people were counting on her. Rick climbed up beside her, handing her a cup of coffee. You think we stand a chance? He asked. Evelyn sipped the coffee, her gaze unwavering. We do, because we don't have a choice. Rick nodded, his respect for her growing. I'm glad you came through here. We needed someone like you. Evelyn gave him a small smile. Sometimes, the fight finds you. All we can do is rise to meet it. As darkness enveloped the town, a quiet anticipation settled over Ruby's place. Evelyn walked through the diner, checking in with each volunteer. Lisa approached her, a worried expression on her face. You sure we're ready for this? Evelyn nodded. As ready as we'll ever be. Outside, the faint sound of motorcycle engines echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. Evelyn's voice rang out, steady and commanding. Positions, everyone. It's time. The townspeople moved into place, their fear overshadowed by a newfound determination. Evelyn stepped outside, standing at the center of the street. She watched as the headlights of the blood vultures' bikes pierced the darkness. The storm was coming, but Evelyn Hayes was ready. The night was unnaturally still, broken only by the distant roar of motorcycle engines echoing through the hills. Evelyn stood in the middle of Main Street, her figure silhouetted against the faint glow of streetlights. Her hand gripped the radio as she gave the final instructions. Positions confirmed? Rick's voice crackled over the line. Roof team in place. Deputy Miller chimed in from his patrol car. Roadblocks set on the north and west sides. No way out once they're in. Evelyn's heart raced, but her voice remained calm. Copy. Everyone stay sharp. The blood vultures were close now, the hum of engines growing into a thunderous chorus. Evelyn signaled to Rick, who nodded from his perch on Ruby's roof, binoculars trained on the road. They're coming down the east route, Rick whispered into the radio. Evelyn replied, hold until they hit the traps. Everyone, stay low. The first wave of bikers came into view, a convoy of 8 riders. Their leader, the scar-faced man Evelyn had confronted earlier, was at the front. The gang barreled down the narrow dirt road toward town, headlights cutting through the darkness. Just as they reached the first bend, the trap was sprung. A chain stretched taut across the road snapped up, catching the front wheels of their bikes. 2 riders were thrown from their motorcycles, skidding into the dirt. The rest swerved, their bikes bucking wildly. One veered off the road into a patch of concealed spike strips, the tires bursting with a deafening pop. Shouts and curses filled the air as the bikers scrambled to regroup. Evelyn's voice came through the radio, sharp and decisive. Now! From the rooftops, Rick and his team opened fire. Not with lethal rounds, but with paintball guns loaded with hard rubber pellets. The shots rained down on the gang, catching them off guard and forcing them to retreat to cover. Scar, the gang leader, roared in frustration as he pulled his bike upright. Spread out. Find where they're hiding. The remaining bikers obeyed, fanning out to search for threats. But the townsfolk had prepared well. Each alley was blocked with barricades, and every path funneled the gang deeper into town, away from their escape routes. Evelyn stayed hidden in the shadows, watching their movements. She spoke into the radio. Team 2, prepare to move. From behind an overturned truck, a group of townspeople led by Deputy Miller emerged. Armed with slingshots and makeshift shields, they pelted the bikers with marbles and stones, keeping them disoriented. Scar shouted to his men, fall back. Regroup by the diner. Evelyn smirked. Exactly where we want you. The gang stumbled into Main Street, their numbers reduced and their confidence shaken. Scar surveyed the area, his face twisted in rage. Whoever's behind this, show yourself, he bellowed. Evelyn stepped out from the shadows, standing tall in the center of the street. Looking for me? Scar's eyes narrowed. You again. What's the plan here, lady? You think a few tricks will stop us? Evelyn's calm demeanor only infuriated him further. No, she said. I think your time of terrorizing this town is over. Scar sneered. Big words for one woman. Let's see you back them up. He motioned to 2 of his men, who charged toward her. Evelyn didn't flinch. At that moment, Rick's team launched their second attack. From above, a barrage of nets and ropes fell over the bikers, tangling their movements. Evelyn seized the opportunity, swiftly disarming one of the charging men and using his own momentum to send him sprawling. The other hesitated, realizing too late that Evelyn wasn't an easy target. With a swift kick, she knocked him off balance, his weapon clattering to the ground. Scar watched in disbelief as his men faltered. From the sidelines, Deputy Miller's voice rang out. Drop your weapons. You're surrounded. Scar laughed bitterly. Surrounded by who? Farmers and truckers? This isn't over. Evelyn took a step closer, her voice low but lethal. It is for you. Look around, Scar. You're out of options. One by one, the remaining bikers realized the truth. Their bikes were immobilized, their weapons scattered, and their leader was losing control. Scar, refusing to back down, lunged toward Evelyn. She sidestepped his attack with practiced ease, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. He growled in pain but refused to yield. You're done, Scar, she said. Call off your men. Scar spat at the ground. Not a chance. Evelyn tightened her grip. Fine, then we'll finish this our way. With Scar subdued, the remaining bikers surrendered. The townsfolk emerged from their hiding places, cautiously surrounding the gang. Rick and Deputy Miller moved to secure the captured bikers, tying their hands and leading them to the patrol car. Evelyn stood over Scar, who glared up at her with a mix of hatred and grudging respect. This isn't over, he muttered. For you it is, Evelyn replied. But for this town, it's just the beginning of taking back what's theirs. The townspeople cheered, their voices echoing through the night. For the first time in years, they felt a sense of control over their lives. As the adrenaline faded, Evelyn looked around at the faces of those she'd fought beside. This was their victory, but she knew the fight wasn't entirely over. The blood vultures wouldn't let this go so easily. Still, for tonight, they had one. And that was enough. The night passed slowly, with the lingering hum of tension fading as the town of Ruby's Place began to take stock of its victory. The bikes of the blood vultures were scattered across Main Street, some wrecked beyond repair, others abandoned in haste. The bikers were securely tied up and waiting to be dealt with, and the rest of the town had gathered inside Ruby's Place, unsure of what would come next but relieved by the fleeting quiet. Evelyn sat in the corner, wiping her brow with the back of her hand, her fingers stained with dirt and adrenaline. She looked out the window, watching the townsfolk begin to clean up the mess. The streets were eerily calm, the danger now at a distance, but there was a certain heaviness that still clung to the air. Rick approached her, his expression both proud and weary. He sat across from her at a table, looking her over with a mixture of respect and disbelief. "You did it, Evelyn," he said quietly. "You got them all." She nodded, though her thoughts were far from victorious. "It's not over. They'll come back, with more people. It's just the way they are." Rick frowned. "Maybe, but not like this. You've made them feel pain, and that's something they don't forget. They won't be able to just walk in here and take what they want without thinking twice." Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "We'll be ready, but next time, we won't have the luxury of surprise." As the night drew on, Deputy Miller convened with Evelyn and Rick to discuss their next steps. The gang was being held in a makeshift jail constructed from the diner's basement, and the mood was tense but resolute. "They're stubborn, no doubt about it," Deputy Miller said. "But we can't just keep them here indefinitely. We'll need a plan to send them off with a clear message, and if they get out, we need to make sure they don't come back." Evelyn considered his words carefully. "We have to make sure we're ready for them if they do return. We need to strike first, and we need to hit hard. If we send a message that we're not scared, maybe they'll rethink ever coming back to Ruby's Place." Rick grunted in agreement. "This town isn't big, but it's ours. We won't let them take it. If they do come back, it's going to be war." Evelyn met both of their gazes. "Then let's make sure we're the ones in control of the battlefield next time. I won't let anyone take this town from me." The next few days were filled with activity. Evelyn worked with Rick, Deputy Miller, and the other townsfolk to fortify Ruby's Place even further. More barricades were built, better traps were set, and lookouts were positioned in key areas. The truckers, farmers, and locals knew they had to work as a unit. This town was small, but it was a home they weren't about to lose. Rick and his team scouted out new routes for potential ambushes, while the townsfolk prepared for the worst. Everyone knew that if the blood vultures returned, it would be a fight to the end. Evelyn's role became increasingly vital as she acted as both a leader and strategist, providing her military expertise to shape their defenses. The weight of responsibility weighed on her shoulders, but it was a burden she carried with determination. On the evening of the third day, after the town had settled into its routine of preparation, Evelyn found herself sitting outside her RV, looking at the stars. The cool air felt like a reprieve, but there was a sense of unease hanging just below the surface. Rick joined her, his steps quiet as he sat beside her. For a moment, neither spoke, both lost in the silence. "You've been quiet," he said after a while, breaking the stillness. Evelyn didn't immediately respond. She stared ahead, her mind racing through the scenarios she'd mapped out, each one fraught with danger. "I keep thinking about the ones we didn't save," she finally said. Rick tilted his head, understanding. "You can't save everyone. You did what you could." "It's not enough," she muttered, her voice tinged with frustration. "We're still just surviving. I want to do more. I want to make sure they never have to worry about this again." Rick sighed softly, his eyes on the horizon. "It's not going to be easy, but you've already made a difference. This town isn't the same without you." Evelyn looked at him, her expression softening. "I'm just trying to make sure people have a chance." Rick gave her a smile, small but sincere. "You're doing more than that. You're giving them hope." Later that night, As Evelyn and Rick were discussing their plans in the diner, a car pulled up outside. The headlights pierced the dim interior, and the sound of the engine idling echoed through the quiet street. Evelyn stood, her hand instinctively going to her sidearm, but Rick held up a hand. "It's not the bikers," he said. The door opened, and a familiar face stepped out, Deputy Miller. He was holding a large envelope, and his usual stoic expression was replaced by one of concern. "What's wrong?" Evelyn asked as she met him at the door. Miller handed her the envelope. "We've got a lead. It's from the larger gang network. There's word on the street that someone bigger is coming. Someone worse than Scar." Evelyn took the envelope, her heart sinking. She opened it and scanned the contents. "This is bad," she said quietly. Rick joined them, looking over her shoulder at the letter. "Who is it?" "An old name," Evelyn replied, her voice grim. "The Reapers. They've been hunting the blood vultures for years. If they're involved, this could get much worse." Miller nodded. "They'll hit hard and fast. You've prepared, but you'll need more firepower." Evelyn's expression hardened as she made her decision. "Then we'll find what we need. This town isn't just going to roll over." She turned to the others, her resolve strengthening. "The blood vultures may be the first, but they won't be the last. We'll be ready for whoever comes next." The days that followed were filled with anticipation and preparation. News of the larger threat, the Reapers, loomed over the town, but Evelyn refused to let fear take hold. She knew the people of Ruby's Place had already shown their courage. They had stood together before and would do so again. As night fell on the final day before the expected attack, Evelyn stood once again in the center of Main Street. The streets were lined with makeshift barricades, and the air was thick with the scent of metal and sweat. The townsfolk were ready. This was their fight, and no matter what came next, they would face it together. The town of Ruby's Place was eerily quiet as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. The calm was deceptive, like the pause before the crash of a thunderstorm. Every townsperson knew the danger was imminent. Evelyn stood at the edge of the street, her eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. Her thoughts were sharp, every sense alert, but beneath the cool exterior, anxiety gnawed at her. Rick approached her quietly, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Evelyn turned to face him, her gaze hard. "I've been ready for a long time, but these are different kinds of people. The Reapers don't play by any rules." Rick nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. The blood vultures were dangerous, but the Reapers were something else entirely. They were known for their ruthlessness, their tactics often leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. "We've got what we need. We've been through hell before," Rick continued, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We'll get through this too." Evelyn met his eyes, a flicker of something, determination, perhaps, flashing across her face. "We have to. There's no turning back now." As night fell fully, Evelyn called an emergency meeting at Ruby's Place, the diner now serving as the unofficial headquarters for the town's resistance. The room was filled with wary, tense faces, truckers, farmers, families, everyone who had a stake in protecting this place. Despite the palpable fear in the air, there was also a quiet sense of unity. They were all here because they had something to protect. Evelyn stood at the front of the room, Rick and Deputy Miller flanking her. She surveyed the crowd, taking in the faces of those who had made it through the previous skirmish, and those who hadn't been here before but were willing to fight for the town. "Listen up," she began, her voice strong, cutting through the chatter. "The Reapers are coming, and they're bringing more firepower than we've ever seen. But we know the terrain. We know how they operate. And we know that if we stand together, we have a shot at stopping them." The room was silent. Every person in the diner could feel the weight of her words. She didn't need to say more. The townsfolk were ready. "Rick, Miller, and I have a plan. But we need everyone's help. This won't be easy, but we don't have a choice. If they take Ruby's Place, there's nothing left for us. So we fight. We fight for our homes, for our families, and for each other." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. People stood, nodding, fists clenched in resolve. It was the same spirit that had helped them survive the previous attacks, and now they would need it more than ever. Evelyn turned to Rick and Miller. We'll need 2 teams. One will defend the diner, the other will work the perimeter. We can't afford to leave any gaps. Rick pointed to the map of the town spread across the table. We've marked the key points. Here, here, and here. If they come through the north side, we'll be waiting. Deputy Miller spoke up. The people who aren't on the front lines will help us secure our supplies. We'll need every last bit of ammo, food, and water we can get. No one gets left behind. Evelyn looked at the room one last time, her eyes meeting each person's gaze. We all know what we're up against, but I believe in every one of you. If we hold this town, we hold the line. Let's make sure they know we're not just a dot on the map. We're a town worth fighting for. The meeting concluded with a sense of shared purpose. The townspeople broke into groups, quietly preparing for the battle ahead, but the tension in the air was palpable. No one spoke of defeat. They couldn't afford to. Hours later, the sound of motorcycles reverberated through the town. At first, it was distant, a low rumble in the distance. But then it grew louder, and the unmistakable roar of engines echoed in the night. Evelyn stood outside, the wind biting at her face as she watched the road. The Reapers were here. They're close, Rick said, his voice steady but sharp. Everyone into position. The townsfolk scattered, taking their places behind barricades, in buildings, and on rooftops. Evelyn took her place beside Rick, her hand resting on her sidearm as she kept a watchful eye on the approaching danger. The headlights of dozens of motorcycles appeared on the horizon, cutting through the darkened street like a line of fire. Evelyn's jaw tightened. They're bringing more than I expected. Rick's eyes narrowed as he scanned the incoming bikers. Looks like they've got a full force with them. But they're not going to get past us. As the motorcycles neared, the first of the riders revved their engines, making a show of force as they sped down the main street. But the moment they reached the first barricade, it was clear that they had underestimated the town's preparation. With a single signal from Evelyn, the traps were set into motion. Flashbangs exploded, disorienting the bikers as nets and ropes fell from above, trapping their bikes in a tangled mess. The sound of chaos filled the street as the bikers scrambled, but the townspeople weren't waiting around. They had been trained well, and they knew exactly what to do. The first wave of Reapers faltered, but they quickly regrouped, shouting commands as they aimed their weapons at the townsfolk. The fight erupted in a flurry of gunshots and shouts, as the townspeople fired from their positions, pushing back the attackers. Evelyn's voice rang out through the chaos. Don't give them an inch. Hold the line. The Reapers, unaccustomed to resistance like this, were slow to adapt. They had underestimated Ruby's place and its people. As the battle raged on, Evelyn moved through the chaos, making sure to check in with every team, ensuring the barricades held and that no one was left vulnerable. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched the bikers fall back, taking cover behind whatever they could find. But they weren't retreating. They were regrouping for a second push. Evelyn knew they couldn't keep this up forever. The Reapers were formidable, and it was only a matter of time before they launched another attack. But for now, the town was holding, and that was enough. As the night drew on, Ruby's place had transformed from a quiet, peaceful town into a fortress, the flickering light of flames from overturned vehicles casting an orange glow over the street. The sounds of battle echoed through the hills. Ruby's place had been tested, but it hadn't broken, and Evelyn knew, deep down, that as long as she was standing, neither would she. The battle raged into the early hours of the morning, the darkness illuminated by the flash of gunfire and the roar of engines. Ruby's place had become a war zone, but the townspeople had proven their mettle. The barricades held firm, and despite the Reapers' best efforts, they couldn't break through. Evelyn moved through the chaos like a force of nature. Her mind was sharp, every movement calculated. She had been in far worse situations, but this one felt different. The stakes were higher, the risks greater. There was no retreat, no running away. If they lost Ruby's place, they'd lose everything. Rick was by her side, as always, his presence a steadying force amid the chaos. Together, they led the charge against the invaders, directing the town's defense with precision. But even as they pushed back the Reapers, Evelyn knew that this first wave was only the beginning. The Reapers were relentless, and they would be back, with more force than ever. The sudden crackle of a radio interrupted her thoughts. "Evelyn." Deputy Miller's voice came through, frantic. "We've got a breach on the south side. They're getting through the back alleys." Evelyn's stomach twisted. She had been expecting this. The Reapers were too skilled to let a small setback stop them. They would flank, they would adapt, and they would find a way in. "Rick, take the front. I'll go with Miller to cover the south. Stay sharp, and don't let them get close." Without waiting for a response, Evelyn bolted for the south side, her mind running through the scenarios. She couldn't afford to be distracted. If the Reapers breached the town's heart, everything would fall apart. By the time Evelyn and Miller reached the south side, the situation had already escalated. The first line of defense had been overrun, the barricades torn apart. The Reapers were pushing through, guns blazing, their faces masked with cold indifference. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She grabbed Miller's arm and pulled him into cover, their eyes scanning the chaos for any sign of weakness in the enemy's lines. "Where's the backup?" Evelyn demanded, her voice sharp. "Coming, but they're spread thin," Miller replied, his eyes narrow as he surveyed the attackers. "We need to buy time." Evelyn's gaze locked onto the leader of the Reapers, a tall man with a scar running across his cheek. He stood at the front, barking orders. She could see the malice in his eyes even from a distance. This wasn't just a fight. It was personal, and she was determined to make him regret coming after Ruby's place. "Get ready," Evelyn whispered to Miller. "We're going to make them pay for every inch of ground." The south side was a nightmare. The Reapers were fast, moving with a precision that betrayed their military training. They knew how to flank, how to corner their enemies, and how to strike when least expected. It was clear that Evelyn and the townspeople were up against a force unlike any they had faced before. As Evelyn moved to take out one of the Reapers, a bullet whizzed past her, grazing her shoulder. She cursed, instinctively ducking behind a crumbling wall. The pain was sharp, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. "We've got to push them back," she muttered to herself, her hand pressing against the wound to stem the bleeding. "We can't let them advance." The gunfire continued, each shot sending waves of tension through the group. Miller, ever the professional, returned fire with deadly accuracy, his movements calm despite the chaos around them. Evelyn admired his composure, but she knew the clock was ticking. After what felt like hours, the sounds of reinforcements began to filter through the air. Rick's voice came over the radio, gruff but determined. "We're pushing them back on the north side. Hold your ground, Evelyn. We're almost there." Evelyn felt a surge of hope. If they could just hold on a little longer, they might just win this fight. The turning point came when the Reapers, realizing they were being outflanked, tried to regroup. Evelyn saw her chance. She nodded to Miller, who gave her a quick thumbs up before sprinting toward the enemy's weak flank. Evelyn was right behind him, moving quickly despite the pain in her shoulder. The Reapers were momentarily distracted, focusing on the incoming reinforcements from the north. It was all the opening they needed. The fight was brutal and swift. Evelyn's mind was a blur of motion, her instincts taking over as she fought with everything she had. Every shot, every movement, was decisive. She could feel the weight of the town's survival on her shoulders. With a final, decisive push, the last of the Reapers were driven out, their retreating figures disappearing into the night. The sound of engines revving grew fainter as they sped off into the distance, leaving behind only the wreckage of their failed assault. The streets of Ruby's place were silent in the aftermath, save for the sounds of labored breathing and the distant crackling of flames. The townspeople, battered and bruised, emerged from their hiding spots, surveying the damage. There were casualties. Some had fallen in the fight, and others were wounded, but they had held their ground. Evelyn stood among them, her hand still pressed against her shoulder. She could feel the sting of exhaustion creeping in, but it was overshadowed by the quiet pride swelling in her chest. They had won. Ruby's place was still theirs. But there was no celebration. The battle wasn't over. The Reapers had retreated for now, but Evelyn knew it was only a matter of time before they came back, and next time, they would be more prepared. Rick approached her, his face grim. "We did it. We held them off." Evelyn nodded, her voice tired but resolute. For now, but we can't let our guard down. The Reapers will return, and when they do, we'll be ready. The townspeople gathered around her, their faces tired but grateful. They had survived the night, and as the dawn began to break over Ruby's place, they knew that they had something worth protecting. Evelyn turned to face the crowd, her voice firm. This town is ours, and we're not giving it up. Not to anyone. As the first light of day cast its glow over Ruby's place, it was clear that the fight was far from over. But Evelyn's resolve was unwavering. She would fight until the last breath to protect her home and the people who had become her family. The sun rose over Ruby's place, casting a soft golden light across the battlefield that had been the town streets just hours before. The remnants of the Reapers' assault were scattered across the town. Burnt-out motorcycles, broken fences, and the occasional smoldering wreckage of a truck. Yet amid the destruction, the people of Ruby's place had emerged victorious, battered but unbroken. Evelyn stood on the steps of the diner, surveying the aftermath. Her shoulder ached from the bullet graze, but it was a small price to pay for their survival. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and the distant sound of sirens, but the immediate danger had passed, for now. Rick approached, his face smeared with dirt and exhaustion. His usual calm demeanor was still intact, but Evelyn could see the toll the battle had taken on him. "We did it," he said, his voice gravelly. "But there's more coming, Evelyn. You know that, right?" Evelyn nodded, her eyes focused on the horizon. "I know, but we've bought ourselves some time. The Reapers won't forget this." Rick let out a heavy sigh and glanced around. The town had held, but they had paid a price for it. He was right. The victory was temporary. The Reapers had learned something about Ruby's place that they wouldn't forget. "We need to rebuild," Rick continued, his gaze moving to the people already starting to clear the streets, repairing what they could. "We need to make sure they never get this close again." Evelyn's eyes softened as she watched the people of Ruby's place, men, women, and children, all working together to restore the town. There were no leaders or followers here. They were a community bound together by the same will to survive. That was their greatest strength. "First things first," Evelyn said, turning back to Rick. "We need to send a message, not just to the Reapers, but to anyone else who thinks they can take what's ours." The radio crackled to life, the familiar static filling the air as Deputy Miller's voice came through. "Evelyn, we've got word from the surrounding areas. The Reapers didn't just target us, they've been hitting smaller towns." Word's spreading fast. Evelyn's grip on the radio tightened. "What does that mean for us?" "It means they're spreading out," Miller responded. "The other towns are preparing for a fight, but it's going to take time for them to gather support. Ruby's place could be the spark that lights a bigger fire." Evelyn's mind raced. She had always known that Ruby's place was just one part of a much larger story. The Reapers weren't just targeting her town. They were testing a theory. They wanted to see how far they could push before people started to fight back. "Then we make sure Ruby's place is the spark they never saw coming," Evelyn said, her voice hard with resolve. "We need to make an example of them. The Reapers think they can just take what they want. It's time we show them what happens when they pick the wrong fight." Rick, who had been listening, nodded. "I'll get the word out. We've got people who owe us favors, people who owe the town. We can start building alliances." Evelyn smiled faintly, a spark of hope igniting inside her. "We need to send a message that no one can ignore. We fight for Ruby's place, and we fight for anyone who's willing to stand with us." Over the next few days, the people of Ruby's place worked tirelessly to rebuild. The town's defenses were strengthened, barriers reinforced, watchtowers constructed, and ammunition restocked. The townspeople were determined, their spirits lifted by the promise of reinforcements. Rick and Evelyn took the lead in reaching out to neighboring communities, rallying them to the cause. Word spread quickly, and before long, a coalition of small towns and outposts began to form. They weren't much, but together they would be a formidable force. Each town that pledged its support added strength to their cause. The messages sent to the Reapers were clear. Ruby's place would not fall, and no one was safe from the retaliation of the people they had underestimated. But as the alliance grew, so did the tension. Evelyn knew that, despite the unity they were building, the Reapers would not stop at Ruby's place. They would see this coalition as a threat, and that meant the real fight had only just begun. As Ruby's place began to stabilize, Evelyn spent most of her time strategizing with the leaders of the new alliance. They worked through the night, drawing up plans and contingencies, training the people who had never seen combat and preparing for the possibility of a larger confrontation. Rick remained by her side, always a steady presence. But even he couldn't hide the worry in his eyes. The Reapers had proven themselves dangerous, and Evelyn knew it was only a matter of time before they came for everything they had built. "They're out there," Rick said one night, looking over the map that lay spread across the table. "And when they come back, they won't be alone. They'll bring reinforcements. The last time was just a test." Evelyn looked at the map, tracing the paths of the Reapers as they moved from one small town to the next. She knew he was right. The Reapers weren't just trying to conquer. They were trying to break the spirit of the people. They wanted to send a message, one that would instill fear and submission. But Ruby's place wasn't afraid. "We're ready," Evelyn said, her voice a quiet promise. "When they come back, we'll be ready. This time, we don't fight to survive. We fight to win." Rick nodded, his jaw tightening. This isn't just about Ruby's place anymore. It's about every town that stands against them. If we can stop the Reapers here, it sends a message to every other community out there. Evelyn stood, her resolve hardening. "Exactly. This is about more than us. This is about taking a stand. We don't just survive, we take control of our future." As the night deepened and the map remained covered in plans and coordinates, Evelyn knew that the war they were about to fight would be like nothing they had faced before. But for the first time since the Reapers had arrived, she felt a flicker of hope. They had fought and won before. They could do it again. But they wouldn't just fight. They would make sure the Reapers knew they had messed with the wrong town. The days that followed were filled with tension and anticipation. Ruby's place, once a quiet, almost forgotten outpost, had become the heart of a growing resistance. The alliance of towns began to take shape, and despite their size and lack of resources, the people were unified by one singular goal: survival. Evelyn stood at the center of it all, organizing the defense and preparing for what she knew would be the final confrontation with the Reapers. They had the element of surprise on their side for now, but she was under no illusion that the next time the Reapers came, they would be better prepared. It was a matter of when, not if. Rick had been working tirelessly, coordinating with the other towns, making sure they knew the stakes. But even as they gathered forces, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. They were on the cusp of something big, a fight that could determine the future of their world. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, the leaders of the alliance gathered in the town hall. There were representatives from 3 other towns, small communities that had been terrorized by the Reapers in the past. Evelyn's eyes swept over the room, taking in the faces of the men and women who had agreed to stand with them. Most of them were farmers or shopkeepers, people who had never fired a gun in their lives, but were now willing to fight for the chance to live on their own terms. Some of them looked uncertain, others resolute. But all of them were here for the same reason. They wanted to protect their families. "We're going to have to work together," Evelyn said, her voice steady and commanding. "We have the advantage of numbers, but if we don't coordinate, we're going to lose everything. We fight as one or we fall apart." One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered leader from a town to the north, spoke up. "We're willing to fight with you, but I need to know this isn't just some foolhardy plan. If the Reapers come with their full force, can we hold out? Can we win?" Evelyn's gaze locked with his, her determination unshaken. "We can win, but it's going to take everything we've got." He seemed to weigh her words for a moment before nodding. "Then we'll stand with you. But this isn't just your fight, Evelyn. It's everyone's." The others murmured their agreement, and for the first time in days, Evelyn allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. It was small, fragile even, but it was there. They weren't just defending Ruby's place anymore. They were defending a way of life. The first signs of the Reaper's return came as a whisper on the wind. Rumors spread like wildfire. Vehicles spotted moving through the nearby forests, strange sounds echoing from the distance. The Reapers were coming. They were closer than anyone had expected. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she gathered her most trusted people in the war room. The time for preparation was over. They had only hours before the enemy would arrive. "We've got one shot at this," she said, looking around the room. "They're bringing everything they've got. We're not just defending a town anymore. We're sending a message. We need to hit them hard, and we need to hit them first." Rick stood beside her, the same grim expression on his face. "The towns that have joined us are ready. But they're not soldiers, Evelyn. Some of them are scared. They've never fought like this before." "I know," Evelyn said, her voice tight with determination. "But they're here, and that means they're willing to fight. We'll train them, show them what they need to do. We don't have time to second-guess ourselves." Rick nodded. "Let's do it, then." The tension in the room was palpable. There was no turning back now. The day of the battle arrived with an eerie calm. The sky was overcast, the air thick with anticipation. The people of Ruby's Place and their allies had fortified the town as best as they could. Lookout posts had been established, barricades reinforced, and makeshift weapons distributed to those who could wield them. Every person, young and old, had a role to play. Evelyn paced the town's main street, her eyes scanning the horizon. It was almost too quiet. She knew the Reapers were out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, a single shot rang out in the distance, followed by a series of rapid gunfire. The Reapers had arrived. "Take your positions," Evelyn shouted, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. She grabbed her rifle and ran toward the front lines, her heart racing. The battle erupted almost instantly. The first wave of Reapers, riders on powerful motorcycles and armed with assault rifles, stormed the outskirts of Ruby's Place. They were fast and ruthless, but the people of Ruby's Place were ready. The first line of defense held firm, despite the intense firepower coming from the enemy. Rick's voice came over the radio. "We've got them pinned down on the west side, but they're coming in strong from the south. Keep your heads down." Evelyn moved with purpose, directing the defense and watching as the battle unfolded. The sound of gunfire filled the air, and the streets of Ruby's Place became a battlefield. Yet amidst the chaos, Evelyn could see the determination in the eyes of the people fighting beside her. They were no longer just defending their homes. They were fighting for a future. The Reapers fought like demons, pushing relentlessly into the town. But Ruby's Place had one advantage that the Reapers hadn't counted on: the strength of a community that refused to back down. As the battle raged on, Evelyn saw an opening. The Reapers' forces were split, trying to push through multiple points of entry. It was their biggest mistake. She nodded to Rick, who signaled their allies to make a coordinated move. The ambush was set. With precision, they struck, catching the Reapers off guard. Evelyn and her team worked quickly to push them back, forcing them into retreat. But the fight wasn't over yet. As the battle raged into the night, the Reapers made their final push. A massive convoy of armored vehicles rolled toward Ruby's Place, led by the scarred Reaper leader. This was their last chance to take the town. Evelyn stood with her rifle at the ready, her eyes fixed on the incoming convoy. She knew this was it, the moment that would decide the future of Ruby's Place. As the vehicles approached, Evelyn gave the order. "Light them up." The first explosion rocked the ground, followed by a series of deafening blasts. The convoy screeched to a halt, its drivers confused and disoriented. The townspeople, armed with everything from homemade explosives to makeshift rocket launchers, launched their counterattack. The Reapers fought back, but the odds were against them. Ruby's Place had become a fortress, a place where the spirit of defiance burned brighter than any weapon. By dawn, the Reapers had been driven out of Ruby's Place. Their convoy lay in ruins, the bodies of their fallen scattered across the streets. The cost of victory had been high, but the people of Ruby's Place had stood firm. As the sun rose, casting its first light over the wreckage, Evelyn stood at the edge of town, surveying the aftermath. The town was battered, but it was still theirs. Rick joined her, his face streaked with blood and dirt, but his eyes were filled with pride. "We did it." Evelyn nodded, her voice soft. "We did. But this is only the beginning. The Reapers will be back. But next time, they won't find us so easy to take." And with that, Evelyn knew that Ruby's Place was no longer just a town. It was a symbol of resilience, of defiance. They had fought back, and they had won. But the war was far from over. Ruby's Place had won the battle, but victory came with a heavy cost. The town had withstood the Reaper's assault, but the streets were lined with the scars of war. Buildings that once held memories of peaceful days were now crumbling under the weight of the violence that had overtaken them. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, blood, and the remnants of the explosive weapons that had been used to repel the enemy. Evelyn stood among the wreckage, her hand resting on a broken pillar outside the town hall. She could hear the distant murmurs of people beginning to gather their belongings and start rebuilding. Despite the chaos, there was a sense of unity among them. They had fought, and they had won. But that victory had come at a price. As the survivors of Ruby's Place began to clear the rubble and assess the damage, Evelyn took a quiet moment to reflect. She had led them through this battle, but she knew that leadership came with its own burden. There were faces she would never see again, friends she had lost, and sacrifices that could never be repaid. Rick approached, his voice low. "We've got casualties. Not as many as we could have had, but it's still too many." He paused, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The Reapers won't be the last group to try and take us down. There's more out there." Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She just nodded, her gaze never leaving the horizon. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. The Reapers were just the first wave, a test of the people's will. Evelyn knew they couldn't afford to let their guard down. Not now. Not ever. "We need to rebuild," she said quietly, turning to Rick. "But not just the town. We need to rebuild our defenses, and we need to prepare for what comes next. There's no going back to the way things were before. This is our reality now." Rick nodded, his expression grave. "You're right. But we're not alone in this anymore. We've got allies. People who are ready to stand with us." In the days that followed the Reaper's retreat, the towns that had rallied to Ruby's Place began to send reinforcements to help rebuild. They were soldiers, farmers, craftsmen, people from all walks of life who had decided they would no longer cower in fear. They came in trucks, on horseback, and by foot. There were even a few who had brought their families with them, determined to build a future for their children free of the constant threat of tyranny. Evelyn and Rick met with the leaders of the new alliance, a group made up of the heads of the neighboring towns. They gathered in the back room of the town hall, maps spread out before them, each town marking its own territory and resources. "People are starting to believe in what we're doing," one of the leaders, a woman named Julia from a neighboring town called Horizon Ridge, said. "But we need more. The Reapers won't stop. They're going to come back with everything they've got. And when they do, we have to be ready." Evelyn looked at the map, tracing her finger along the lines of the different towns. "We need to strengthen our connections, not just with weapons, but with people. This is about more than just defense. It's about creating a network. A community that's united not just by need, but by a common purpose." Julia leaned forward. "And what about the rest of the world? The Reapers aren't the only threat out there. There's more, and they're going to want to take what we've got. We have to be ready for everything." "We will be," Evelyn said firmly. "But it starts with us. If we can hold Ruby's Place, if we can show the world that we're willing to fight for what's ours, others will join us. The more we unite, the stronger we'll be." The other leaders nodded in agreement. For the first time since the Reapers had attacked, there was a sense of optimism in the room. They knew the challenges ahead, but they also knew that they were no longer alone. As the days turned into weeks, the work of rebuilding continued. Ruby's Place began to take shape again, albeit differently than before. The streets were more fortified, the houses sturdier, and the townspeople were more organized. There was no more illusion of safety. Everyone was prepared to fight if necessary. Evelyn spent long hours working alongside the townspeople and the new allies. They built defenses, trained soldiers, and began the process of creating a larger communication network. She knew the Reapers would return, and they would bring others with them. But Ruby's Place was no longer the small, isolated town it had once been. It was the nucleus of something bigger, a symbol of hope for those who had long been oppressed. Rick remained by her side throughout it all, his role growing alongside hers. Together, they became the pillars upon which the town stood. Yet, as the days passed, Evelyn could feel the weight of leadership pressing on her shoulders. Every decision she made impacted not just the town, but the future of the alliance. Just as they were starting to feel the faintest glimmer of peace, word came from one of their outposts. Another group, larger and more aggressive than the Reapers, was on the move. This new threat was not just another gang of marauders. They were a well-organized militia with resources, military training, and a single-minded drive to conquer. Evelyn and Rick gathered the alliance leaders once more. The mood had shifted dramatically. What had been a hopeful gathering only weeks before was now charged with urgency and fear. The group on the move was led by a man named Carter, a former soldier who had been dishonorably discharged for his extreme methods during the war years ago. Now, he had built a following, and his army was on a mission to take the region by force. "We've got no time to waste," Evelyn said, her tone steady. "This is not just another raid. We're dealing with a military operation, and they're coming for us. They want more than land. They want control." Rick's eyes darkened. "We need to move fast. They won't waste any time with diplomacy." The leaders of the alliance agreed. There was no more time for preparation. They would have to face this new threat head-on before it reached Ruby's place. The days leading up to the arrival of Carter's militia were filled with frantic preparation. The alliance knew they were outnumbered, but they also knew they had something that Carter's militia did not: unity. The people of Ruby's Place, Horizon Ridge, and the other towns had fought together before, and they would fight again. This time, however, they were not just defending their homes. They were fighting for a future that none of them were willing to surrender. Evelyn stood at the front of the town, her rifle slung over her shoulder, her eyes focused on the horizon. The militia was closing in. This time, there would be no second chances. The battle ahead would determine the future of their world. The first shots would be fired soon, and this time, the stakes were higher than ever. The war for survival was far from over. The night before the militia's arrival was eerily quiet. Ruby's Place had fortified every corner, every street. The people who had once lived in fear were now organized, their resolve as hard as the steel that had been used to reinforce their barricades. Still, the weight of what was to come hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating all other thoughts. Evelyn stood on the hill overlooking the town, Rick beside her. The campfires of their allies flickered in the distance, casting long shadows that stretched across the landscape. It was almost too quiet, the calm before the storm. "They'll come at dawn," Evelyn said, her voice low but steady. "We need to hold them back long enough to create an opening. It's our only chance." Rick nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You've led us this far, Evelyn. We just have to trust in what we've built." She turned to face him, her expression firm. "I'm not just leading anymore. We're all in this together." Rick gave her a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. The weight of the impending battle was heavy on them all. Evelyn knew that no matter how much they had prepared, there were too many unknowns, too many variables. And the leader of the militia, Carter, had a reputation for being ruthless. His tactical mind was as sharp as his cruelty. "We've got the advantage of surprise," Rick said, his voice tinged with a hint of uncertainty. "But we don't know how they're going to move once they hit the perimeter. We'll need to stay fluid." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "We'll keep them on the defensive, no matter what it takes." As dawn broke, the sky a pale blue, a thick silence still hung over Ruby's Place. The wind carried the faint sound of distant engines, first a hum, then a roar. The militia was almost upon them. Evelyn gave the signal, and the town's defenses went into motion. The people who had spent days preparing for this moment sprang into action. Armed with rifles, bows, and even improvised weapons, they took their positions along the town's perimeter. Tension rippled through the crowd, but there was no turning back. The first wave of militia vehicles broke through the tree line. They were heavily armed, military trucks carrying armed men, while armored vehicles provided a second line of defense. Carter was taking no chances. He had come with the full force of his army. Evelyn's hand tightened around her rifle. "They're not wasting any time." She turned to Rick. "Let's move. Keep them in the open." The first shot rang out, a sharp crack that pierced the morning air, and all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted, echoing through the trees as the militia tried to advance. Evelyn's plan was simple: slow them down, disrupt their movements, and break their morale. They had the element of surprise, But they couldn't win this by force alone. They had to outsmart them. Rick's voice came over the radio. They're pushing hard on the west side. We need reinforcements. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She signaled to the west side defenders, reinforcing their position and ensuring they held strong against the initial wave of militia. The town's defenses, hastily thrown together but strategically placed, began to show their worth. The first few vehicles were disabled by the homemade explosives set along the roads, and the militia was forced to slow down. However, as Evelyn had feared, Carter's militia adapted quickly. They began to fan out, forcing the defenders to spread themselves thin. The small townspeople, unaccustomed to large-scale combat, struggled to maintain their positions. But they fought with a fierce determination, knowing that their very survival depended on it. Hours into the battle, the militia's relentless push began to take its toll. They had overrun several of the outer defenses, and the sound of gunfire grew louder. Evelyn's heart raced in her chest. The town was holding, but just barely. Then came the sound of heavy machinery. A massive piece of military equipment, a tank-like vehicle, rumbled into view. Carter had brought in a weapon that Ruby's Place was not prepared for. "This isn't good," Rick muttered, looking at the approaching tank. Evelyn's mind raced. They had prepared for armed men, for small skirmishes, but they hadn't anticipated a full-scale assault with military-grade weaponry. The tank's cannons began to fire, sending shockwaves through the town. Buildings crumbled under the force, and the once sturdy barricades were torn apart in seconds. "We have to stop that tank," Evelyn said, determination burning in her eyes. "Now." She grabbed Rick by the arm and pulled him toward a nearby vantage point where they could see the tanks approach clearly. From here, they could see the gaps in its armor. "We need a distraction," Rick said. "I can lead a group to draw its fire while you take the shot." Evelyn nodded. "Do it, and make it quick." Rick led a small group of fighters to create chaos on the other side of the town, drawing the attention of the tank and its crew. Meanwhile, Evelyn, with a handful of her most trusted allies, climbed to the highest point in town, where they had an unobstructed view of the tank's weak points. The tank turned its cannon toward the group, its engine roaring as it closed in. Evelyn took a deep breath, steadied her rifle, and took aim. Her hands were steady, her mind clear. She fired. The bullet hit its mark, a direct shot to the fuel tank. The explosion that followed was deafening. The tank's metal frame was thrown into the air, its destruction sending shockwaves through the ground. The militia hesitated, disoriented by the loss of their most powerful weapon. The tide of battle began to shift. Evelyn and her team didn't stop. They kept pushing, forcing the militia to retreat as the people of Ruby's Place, now emboldened by their victory, rallied together. They pushed back with everything they had. It was a fight for survival, and they were not going to lose. As the last of the militia retreated, the survivors of Ruby's Place stood victorious. Their homes, their families, everything they had worked for, was still intact. But the cost of that victory was not lost on anyone. Evelyn looked over the battlefield. The once bustling streets were littered with debris, the bodies of both their enemies and their fallen comrades scattered across the land. There were no words to describe the emptiness that lingered in her chest. Rick walked up beside her, his expression weary but proud. "We did it." Evelyn nodded, but her heart remained heavy. "It's not over, Rick. They'll keep coming. We can't stop now." And she was right. While they had driven Carter's militia away, the fight for their future was far from finished. Ruby's Place had survived this battle, but it would take more than just one victory to change the world. It would take a new kind of war, one where the stakes were higher than ever. But for now, at least, Ruby's Place was still standing, and that was something worth fighting for. The days following the militia's retreat were filled with both relief and urgency. Ruby's Place had been saved, but the town's defenses were shaken, and the toll of the battle left its mark on everyone. The survivors moved quickly to tend to their wounded, bury their dead, and begin the slow process of rebuilding what had been lost. Evelyn walked through the town, her eyes lingering on the ruined homes and makeshift barricades, her thoughts heavy. The militia had been defeated, but their retreat was just the beginning of something larger. There was no doubt in her mind that more groups would rise to challenge them, that more battles would come. And she knew that Ruby's Place would have to be ready, not just with walls and weapons, but with the strength of unity. Rick approached her, a look of determination in his eyes. The town's picking up, but we can't rest. We need to fortify our defenses even more, and we need to recruit more people. Evelyn glanced at him, a weary but resolute expression on her face. I know. We'll need allies if we're going to stand a chance against what's coming. Rick nodded, the weight of the task ahead heavy on his shoulders. I've already reached out to a few of the neighboring settlements. Some are willing to send reinforcements. Others, they're not so sure. We need to convince them, Evelyn said, her voice firm. We can't do this alone. We need to show them that Ruby's Place is more than just a town. It's a symbol that we're not backing down. Ruby's Place had always been a small, tight-knit community, but as the world had grown darker, Evelyn had learned the importance of building a broader network of support. They couldn't afford to rely on just themselves. The enemy was larger, better armed, and more organized than they had imagined. Evelyn and Rick set out on a journey to neighboring towns, hoping to forge new alliances. They traveled by foot, moving through forests and fields, seeking the towns that had once been untouched by the chaos of war. The journey was long, and the world outside Ruby's Place felt increasingly hostile. Their first stop was a place called Stonebridge, a small town known for its fortified walls and distrust of outsiders. The people there had managed to stay out of the conflict, living off the land and staying under the radar. Evelyn and Rick arrived at dusk, weary but determined. The town was surrounded by high stone walls, and a single guard stood at the gate, eyeing them warily as they approached. Rick spoke first, his tone measured. We come in peace. We're from Ruby's Place. We've recently fought off a militia, but we know there are more groups out there. We need help. The guard looked them over, skeptical. And why would we help you? Stonebridge has always kept to itself. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice calm but strong. Because if we don't stand together, we'll all fall. We've seen it firsthand. The Reapers, Carter's militia, they won't stop. We're asking for your support, but more importantly, we're offering you a chance to stand with us, to protect what's left of our world. There was a long silence, and the guard turned to consult with others inside. After what felt like an eternity, the gate creaked open, and an older man stepped out to meet them. I'm Marcus, he said, his voice gravelly from years of use. And you're right about one thing. These attacks aren't going to stop. We've heard about the trouble in Ruby's Place, and we've seen how fast things are escalating. Evelyn nodded. We need to unite. The more we can bring together, the stronger we'll be. Will you join us? Marcus studied her for a moment before nodding slowly. We'll help, but it won't be easy. There's a price for everything in this world. Rick's eyes narrowed, but Evelyn held up a hand, stopping him. She knew what Marcus was getting at. We'll work something out. We're not asking for handouts. We're asking for a partnership. Agreed, Marcus said, offering a small, weary smile. Let's talk about the details. And be prepared to defend what you're asking for. It's not just about what we can do for you. It's about what you can offer in return. The alliance between Ruby's Place and Stonebridge was forged, but the road ahead was anything but smooth. They had gained a powerful ally, but with it came new challenges. The people of Stonebridge were self-sufficient, proud of their ability to survive on their own. Now, they had to learn to trust others, and trust was something that was hard to come by in these times. As they worked together to strengthen their combined defenses, tensions began to rise. The people of Ruby's Place were eager to expand their reach, to create a network of towns that could stand together against any threat. But the people of Stonebridge, while willing to fight, were hesitant to fully embrace the idea of an alliance. It's not that we don't want to help, Marcus said one evening, as he and Evelyn sat together, discussing the alliance's future. It's that we've learned the hard way that trust is earned. People are quick to betray, quick to turn their backs when the going gets tough. Evelyn understood. She had seen it herself, but she also knew that without trust, there would be no future. Without unity, they were nothing more than a collection of isolated survivors, easy targets for anyone who sought to destroy them. I get it, Marcus, she said, her voice soft but firm, but we don't have time to waste. We need to build something bigger than just our towns. We need to show the world that we're stronger together. Marcus sighed. I hope you're right. But be prepared. There will be those who won't accept this, and they won't just let us walk away. As Evelyn and Rick worked to solidify the alliance, a new challenge emerged. Word came that another militia, this one even larger than Carter's, was on the move. The rumors were vague, but the one thing they all had in common was the mention of a man named Victor. Victor was a name that sent shivers down Evelyn's spine. He was known as a ruthless warlord, a man who had carved out a small empire of his own in the aftermath of the chaos. His forces were rumored to be vast, and his reputation for violence was unmatched. The townspeople of Ruby's Place, Stonebridge, and the surrounding areas could feel the storm brewing on the horizon. They had fought together once, but this time, the stakes were higher. The battle would not just be for survival. It would be a fight for the future of the region. Evelyn stood before the gathered leaders of the alliance, her face grim. We've faced challenges before, but this is different. Victor's forces won't hesitate. If we're going to survive this, we need to be ready. This time, we're not just defending our homes. We're defending everything we've worked for. Rick stepped up beside her, his voice unwavering. We've got one advantage. We're not alone. And as long as we stay united, we'll have a chance. But deep down, Evelyn knew the truth. Victor was not just a threat to their homes. He was a threat to their very way of life. And this time, the battle would not be won by strength alone. It would take something much deeper: hope, unity, and the will to fight for a future that was worth saving. As the sun set on Ruby's Place, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of their journey was just beginning. The days following the news of Victor's approaching army were filled with a sense of dread that weighed heavily on everyone in Ruby's Place and Stonebridge. The alliance had grown stronger, but the magnitude of the threat that loomed on the horizon threatened to unravel everything they had worked for. Evelyn stood at the edge of the camp, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the first signs of Victor's forces were starting to appear. Victor's army wasn't just a group of disorganized raiders. It was a well-equipped, highly disciplined force. Word had spread that he had recruited soldiers from various corners of the wasteland, offering them food, shelter, and protection in exchange for their loyalty. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the promise of a new order. Evelyn had heard enough of Victor's reputation to know that his vision was one of fear, control, and destruction. As the days passed, they received reports of his movements. His forces had been pillaging nearby settlements, leaving scorched earth in their wake. Wherever Victor went, he took everything: people, supplies, and hope. His army grew with each town they destroyed, and his thirst for dominance seemed insatiable. Evelyn gathered the leaders of the alliance in Stonebridge's war room. The walls were adorned with maps of the surrounding regions, marking key towns, roads, and supply routes. Everyone had a role to play, but it was clear that the true battle was about to begin. "We don't know exactly when they'll arrive, but we do know they're coming," Evelyn said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "We need to be ready to fight on multiple fronts. If we're going to stop Victor, we need to do more than defend. We need to take the fight to him." Marcus, the leader of Stonebridge, leaned forward. His weathered face was grim. "We've heard rumors that Victor's army is already over 1,000 strong, and they're heavily armed. We'll never match them in numbers or firepower." Evelyn nodded. "We're not going to match them head-on, but we have something they don't: a home ground advantage. We know this land, we know the terrain, and we know how to use it to our advantage." Rick, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "We'll need traps. Guerrilla tactics. Hit them where they least expect it." Evelyn turned to him. "Exactly. We use the environment to our advantage. We've already set up a series of traps along key routes. We'll harass them, weaken them before they can get close to Ruby's Place or Stonebridge. If we can break their morale, maybe they'll falter. But we'll have to be fast," Marcus warned. "Victor's army won't take kindly to ambushes. They'll retaliate with force, and when they do, we'll be at their mercy if we're not careful." "We won't be caught off guard," Evelyn assured him. "We'll stay in constant motion. We can't afford to let them get too comfortable. We're stronger together, and we'll need to fight like it." The alliance spent the next few days preparing for the worst. The people of Ruby's Place and Stonebridge worked together like never before, fortifying their positions, training their fighters, and setting up traps and ambushes in strategic locations. Evelyn and Rick organized small, mobile units that could strike quickly and retreat before Victor's army could retaliate. The night before the battle, Evelyn stood atop a high hill overlooking the valley. The wind was biting cold, and the sky above was dark with thick clouds. She couldn't shake the feeling that this night would be their last in peace. Rick approached her, his face drawn with exhaustion but determination still burning in his eyes. "You're not alone in this, Evelyn. We've come too far to back down now." She nodded, appreciating his words, but knowing that the fight ahead would be far from simple. "I know, Rick, but we need to keep our heads. The moment we lose our cool is the moment they win." He gave her a slight smile. "We won't lose. Not as long as we have each other." The two stood in silence for a moment, looking out at the darkened landscape. They knew that when dawn broke, everything would change. The next morning, the horizon was tinged with the faintest light, signaling the arrival of Victor's army. The sky was overcast, and the air was thick with tension. Evelyn stood at the front of the gathered forces of Ruby's Place and Stonebridge, her heart pounding in her chest. As the first wave of Victor's soldiers moved into the valley, Evelyn's signal went up, and the traps they had set into the ground sprang to life. Explosions rang out, and the sounds of soldiers yelling in panic filled the air. The first wave of attackers was thrown into disarray as they were caught in the traps, some blown apart by explosives, others tangled in makeshift snares and tripwires. The soldiers, unprepared for such resistance, scrambled to regain their footing. Evelyn's heart raced as she watched the chaos unfold. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. She signaled to Rick, who was leading a separate group of fighters, to begin the next phase. "Let's move," she shouted to her own team. "Stay sharp." The group of fighters charged forward, moving swiftly and silently through the trees and brush. They engaged the disoriented militia, picking off stragglers and slowing their advance. The element of surprise was theirs, and they made every shot count. But even as their ambushes tore through the ranks of Victor's army, Evelyn could see that the sheer number of soldiers was overwhelming. Victor had anticipated a fight, and his forces were quickly regrouping. The battle had only just begun. Evelyn's heart sank as she watched a larger force of heavily armored soldiers march forward, their lines holding firm despite the chaos around them. It was clear now that Victor wasn't just a warlord. He was a tactician, and he wasn't going to be defeated by a handful of guerrilla tactics. By midday, the battle had shifted. While the Alliance's ambushes had been successful at first, Victor's soldiers were regrouping and pushing back. They had heavy artillery and armor, and their numbers were far too great for the Alliance's forces to hold off forever. Evelyn knew they had to change tactics or risk losing everything. "We can't keep this up," Rick shouted as he rejoined her at a rally point. "We need reinforcements. We need to make a final stand." Evelyn didn't need to hear more. She could feel the pressure building as Victor's forces closed in on the heart of their defenses. "Get to the front lines," she said, her voice urgent. "Tell them to fall back to the town's main perimeter. We'll fight there, where we have the advantage." Rick nodded and ran off to relay the orders. Evelyn turned to her small group of fighters. "Everyone, we're pulling back. Let's make them regret underestimating us." They moved quickly, retreating under the cover of smoke and fire, regrouping at Ruby's Place's fortified walls. The final stand would happen here. Evelyn looked at the horizon. She knew that victory would require everything they had, and more. The world outside their walls was waiting to consume them, but within these walls, they would make their stand. This was their last chance. This was their future. Victor's army reached Ruby's Place by the late afternoon, the earth trembling beneath the weight of their advance. The sound of marching feet was deafening. Evelyn and her people stood ready, their backs against the town's fortifications, prepared to fight with everything they had left. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the battle began in earnest. It was no longer just about survival. It was about the soul of the land, about reclaiming what had been lost and forging a new future from the ashes of the old world. The end was near, but they had to win first. The final showdown had begun. Ruby's Place stood silent in the fading light of dusk, the walls that had once been a symbol of safety now bracing against an enemy army that was determined to tear everything down. The Alliance had gathered its strength here, on the cusp of victory or defeat. The people of Ruby's Place and Stonebridge, along with a few brave souls from neighboring towns, stood shoulder to shoulder. The stakes had never been higher. Victor's army approached like a storm, the sound of heavy boots pounding the earth growing louder by the second. They were closing in, a sea of determined soldiers, their faces obscured by masks of iron and steel. Evelyn and Rick stood at the front, flanked by Marcus and a handful of trusted fighters. The air was thick with tension, and the once clear horizon was now filled with the distant roar of engines and the low hum of weaponry. "This is it," Rick said, his voice tight. "We either win, or we don't survive." Evelyn nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. She had always known this moment would come, but now that it was here, she felt the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her. She had seen battles before, but none like this. This wasn't just about holding on to their land. It was about holding on to their future. "We'll make them regret underestimating us," Evelyn replied, her voice steady but filled with resolve. The first shots rang out as the militia's long-range gunners fired from their positions, striking the barricades and forcing the defenders to duck and cover. Evelyn's heart pounded, but she kept her focus. The defenders responded with fire of their own, a volley of gunshots that echoed across the battlefield. Every shot counted. Every move could be the difference between life and death. As the enemy closed in, Evelyn barked orders to the defenders. "Keep them back. Don't let them get close to the walls." The first wave of Victor's soldiers began to charge, their heavy armor glinting in the last light of the day. The defenders fired back with everything they had, the sound of gunfire deafening as it cut through the air. The barricades shook under the pressure, and for a moment, Evelyn feared the walls wouldn't hold. But they did. The attackers reached the first line of defenses, where they were met with a hail of bullets. The militia's armor was tough, but it wasn't invulnerable. For every one of their soldiers who fell, another one took their place, pushing forward relentlessly. "Fall back to the second line," Evelyn shouted, signaling for the defenders to retreat behind the inner barricades. The retreat was orderly, controlled, but the enemy kept advancing, their numbers almost overwhelming. The sight of their relentless march sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. She had hoped the traps and ambushes would slow them down, but Victor's army had learned from previous skirmishes. They adapted quickly, sending scouts ahead to disarm traps and clear the path. The Alliance's advantage in terrain was slowly slipping away. The tide of battle began to shift as Victor's main force arrived at the gates of Ruby's Place. The walls, though sturdy, began to groan under the weight of the enemy's siege equipment. Giant battering rams were wheeled forward, accompanied by explosive charges designed to breach the walls. The first explosion hit with such force that Evelyn felt the ground beneath her feet tremble. The walls were beginning to crack. "They're pushing too hard," Rick said, his voice filled with frustration. "We can't hold them back forever." Evelyn's heart raced, but she refused to show fear. She had seen people break under pressure, and she wouldn't let that happen to her people. She turned to Marcus, who was overseeing the defense from the second line of barricades. "Marcus, we need a plan. We can't let them get through the walls." Marcus gritted his teeth, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the battlefield. "We've got one chance," he said. "We hit them with everything we've got, force them into the center, and then we use the inner traps. It'll be our only shot." Evelyn nodded. "Do it." Rick and Marcus sprang into action, relaying the orders to their fighters. The Alliance would make one final stand, using the last of their resources and traps to force Victor's army into a tight space where they could be overwhelmed. As the enemy pushed forward, the sound of their war cries grew louder. They were at the gates, and it felt like the walls themselves were about to crumble. But Evelyn had one final trick up her sleeve. She had ordered that a large stockpile of explosives be placed underneath the center of Ruby's Place, near the main gates. The idea was risky, but it was their only hope. If they could create a massive explosion that disoriented Victor's army and caused enough chaos, they might stand a chance. Rick, Marcus, and the rest of the fighters took their positions around the explosives, ready to trigger them at the right moment. The battering ram struck the gates again, and Evelyn knew it was time. "Now!" she shouted. The explosion ripped through the center of the battlefield, sending debris flying in all directions. A blinding flash of light lit up the darkening sky, followed by a deafening roar. The force of the blast sent Victor's soldiers tumbling backward, their lines shattered by the sheer power of the explosion. Evelyn's fighters moved quickly, seizing the opportunity. With Victor's forces momentarily disoriented, Evelyn's fighters pushed forward, charging into the chaos. It was a battle like no other. Blood and dust filled the air, the sounds of battle deafening as the two sides collided with a fury that only desperation could create. But even as the battle raged on, Evelyn knew the hardest part was still to come. Victor himself had yet to appear on the battlefield, and she had a feeling that when he did, it would be the real test of their resolve. It didn't take long for her suspicions to prove true. From the heart of his army, Victor emerged, clad in black armor, his face obscured by a cold, cruel mask. His presence on the battlefield was like a storm, intimidating, overwhelming, and utterly relentless. Evelyn met his gaze from across the battlefield, her heart pounding. This was the moment that would determine everything. Victor raised his hand, signaling his troops to regroup. The battlefield fell silent for a brief moment, the tension unbearable. Evelyn could see the smug confidence in Victor's eyes as he sized her up, his lips curling into a smirk. "You've put up a good fight," Victor's voice boomed, carried by the wind. "But this is where it ends." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence. "This is where it ends for you." Victor's smirk faltered for the first time. "You think you can defeat me? I've conquered entire regions. You're nothing but ants." "Maybe," Evelyn replied, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "But ants can bring down giants. And today, you're the giant." The two locked eyes, each knowing that the fate of this battle, and their lives, hung in the balance. The next few moments would decide it all. Victor charged forward, his soldiers closing in around him. The battle resumed with renewed intensity, the two sides clashing with an almost supernatural fury. Evelyn led her fighters forward, taking advantage of the disarray created by the explosion, but even with the advantage, it was clear that Victor's strength and determination would not be so easily overcome. Victor's soldiers were relentless, but the people of Ruby's Place and Stonebridge fought with a fury born of desperation. This wasn't just a fight for land, it was a fight for the future, and they would not let it slip through their fingers. Evelyn moved like a force of nature, her every strike, every decision sharp and precise. But even she couldn't deny the toll the battle was taking. Her muscles ached, her breath came in ragged gasps. She had fought through worse, but this was the fight of their lives, and they were about to win. The battlefield was a cacophony of chaos, the sounds of gunfire, shouting, and the clash of steel ringing in Evelyn's ears. She moved with a fierce determination, directing her fighters and responding to the changing tide of the battle. But despite their relentless efforts, it was becoming clearer by the moment that Victor's forces were too well organized, too prepared. The gap in their resources and numbers was vast. Rick fought beside her, his face set in a grim expression, every swing of his weapon a testament to his unyielding resolve. They had made progress with the explosion, but Victor's army was now regaining its footing, closing ranks and pushing the alliance back toward the heart of Ruby's Place. "We can't hold them forever," Rick shouted over the din of battle, his voice filled with the weight of their situation. "We need a plan." Evelyn's mind raced, every possible option running through her head. She had hoped that the explosion would turn the tide, but Victor was too shrewd to be caught off guard for long. Now, they were fighting for survival. "I've got one," she said, her voice sharp with resolve. "We need to hit him directly. I'll draw him out." Rick's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you crazy? You can't take him on alone." "I won't be alone," Evelyn replied, her gaze hardening as she turned to look at Marcus, who was rallying the troops on the second line. "We need to create a diversion, something that will give me an opening. I'm not letting him walk away from this." Rick hesitated, his concern for her evident, but he knew better than to argue when Evelyn's mind was made up. "Fine, but be careful." "I will," Evelyn promised, though she knew the risks were great. Still, it was the only option they had left. They had to take the fight to Victor, or they would be lost. The diversion was set in motion with precision. Marcus and a few of the most trusted fighters would create chaos near the center of the battlefield, drawing Victor's attention away from the inner defenses. The goal was simple: to distract Victor long enough for Evelyn to get close enough to strike. As Evelyn prepared herself, the reality of what she was about to do settled in. This was no longer just about a battle for survival. It was a battle for everything they stood for. She had come too far, endured too much, to let Victor tear it all down. She glanced at Rick one last time before moving toward the edge of the battlefield. He gave her a nod, the silent understanding passing between them. If she succeeded, they would win. If she failed, if she didn't make it back, everything they had fought for would be in vain. The diversion worked, at least at first. Marcus and his fighters launched a surprise attack on Victor's left flank, creating enough confusion to break through the enemy's lines. The sound of explosions, gunfire, and screams filled the air as Victor's soldiers struggled to regroup. For a brief moment, it seemed like they might actually have a chance. Evelyn seized the opportunity. Moving swiftly through the smoke and chaos, she made her way toward the center of the battlefield, where Victor was directing his troops. She knew she had to move quickly. Victor was a skilled fighter, and he would not be easily taken down. She reached the heart of the battlefield just as Victor emerged from the smoke, his black armor gleaming like a dark star in the center of the chaos. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, Evelyn saw the true weight of his contempt. He had underestimated her before, but now there was no more time for mistakes. "So, the little rebel comes to face me directly," Victor sneered, his voice like cold steel. "I must admit, I'm impressed, but you're too late." Evelyn didn't flinch. It's never too late to end a war. Without another word, she lunged at him, her weapon raised. Victor parried her strike effortlessly, his movements fluid and precise. He was everything she had feared: powerful, ruthless, and experienced in ways she hadn't anticipated. Every strike she made, he blocked with ease. Every move she attempted countered with ruthless efficiency. But Evelyn was quick, her mind constantly calculating, looking for an opening. She knew she couldn't rely on brute force alone. She had to outthink him. The battle raged around them, but in that moment, everything else faded away. It was just Evelyn and Victor, locked in a deadly dance. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps as she dodged another strike from his sword, narrowly avoiding a blow that would have surely ended her life. "You've got spirit," Victor said, a twisted grin on his face. "But spirit doesn't win wars. Power does." Evelyn gritted her teeth, refusing to let his words break her resolve. "Maybe, but the will to fight does." She spotted her opening. Victor's movements were becoming slightly more predictable, his arrogance starting to show. He overextended himself in one attack, leaving his side exposed. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She spun, using the momentum from her own strike to bring her weapon down in a powerful arc, slashing across his exposed flank. Victor's eyes widened in shock as he staggered backward, a deep gash opening along his side. He growled in fury, his hand going to the wound. Blood stained his armor, but it only seemed to drive him into a deeper rage. "You think that'll stop me?" he spat, his voice venomous. "No," Evelyn replied coldly, "but it'll slow you down." With a primal scream, Victor lunged at her again, his fury now clouding his judgment. This time, Evelyn was ready. She sidestepped, using her agility to avoid his wild strike. As he passed her, she turned quickly and plunged her weapon into his side, catching him off guard. Victor's face contorted with pain and disbelief as he crumpled to the ground, his strength draining away with every passing second. Evelyn stood over him, her breath ragged but triumphant. "It's over." Victor's hand twitched, and he looked up at her one last time. "You may have won this battle," he rasped, "but the war is far from over." "I don't think so," Evelyn said softly, stepping back. "This is where it ends." With Victor's death, the momentum of the battle shifted completely. His forces, leaderless and broken, began to retreat in disarray. The alliance, though battered and bruised, pressed on with renewed vigor, sweeping through the battlefield and forcing the remaining soldiers to flee. It wasn't a flawless victory, but it was theirs. The cost had been high. Many brave souls had fallen along the way. But in the end, they had done it. They had stopped Victor. They had saved Ruby's place and the future of the people who called it home. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the battlefield, Evelyn stood amidst the wreckage, her body bruised and bloodied, but her spirit unbroken. She had led them through the darkest hour, and now there was peace. The battle was over, but the journey was far from finished. The real work, the rebuilding, the healing, those would come next, and Evelyn would be there, ready to lead once again. For Ruby's place, for Stonebridge, for the future. The battlefield, once a chaotic mess of craters, smoke, and blood, had fallen silent. The war that had ravaged Ruby's place and the surrounding lands was over. For Evelyn and her people, the victory felt hard-earned, a bittersweet triumph over the relentless force that had threatened to tear everything apart. As the survivors began to collect their fallen, a strange quiet settled over the town. The sounds of mourning and celebration mixed in the air. The lives lost were not forgotten, but the future now seemed within reach, a future that had been uncertain just hours before. Evelyn stood at the edge of the battlefield, her eyes scanning the horizon. She was exhausted, every muscle aching, but there was a small glimmer of peace in her chest. The war was over. The fight was over, but the scars would remain. Rick approached her, his face marked with exhaustion, but his eyes warm with the knowledge that they had won. "We did it," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "We really did it." Evelyn nodded, her gaze never leaving the horizon. "Yeah, we did. But the cost." Rick placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression understanding. "I know. It's hard to even think about it. But we've got time now, Evelyn. Time to rebuild." Rebuilding. It was a word she had heard too many times in the past. Every victory came with a cost, and every peace came with its own set of challenges. But as Rick said, they now had time. Time to heal, time to fix what had been broken. In the days that followed, Ruby's place began its slow recovery. The townspeople worked together, their hands and hearts joined in the task of rebuilding what had been lost. The walls, battered and broken from the siege, were being reinforced. Homes that had been burned to the ground were reconstructed. Even the roads, which had been torn up by the battle, were beginning to be paved once again. But it wasn't just the physical work that needed to be done. The emotional wounds were deep, and healing would take longer than anyone had anticipated. Loss was an ever-present shadow, especially for those who had lost loved ones in the fight. The funeral services were held in the town square, and though the loss was felt deeply, there was also a sense of resolution. They had fought for their freedom, for their future, and they had won. Evelyn found herself drawn to the quieter moments, the reflections that came when the work slowed down, when the dust settled. She spent her evenings walking the streets of Ruby's place, her mind wandering back to the faces of the fallen and the soldiers who had stood by her side. She often found herself standing by the memorial, where the names of the dead were etched into the stone, each one a reminder of the sacrifice they had made. A week after the battle, a small ceremony was held to mark the end of the war and the beginning of a new chapter. Evelyn stood before the townspeople, her heart heavy with both grief and hope. The battle was over, but the work was far from finished. "I stand before you today as someone who knows the price of peace," she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "We've lost so much to get here, but we have something now that we didn't have before. We have the chance to rebuild, to honor the memories of those we've lost by making this place something worth fighting for." The crowd was silent, their eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. They had all been through so much. But Evelyn was right. This was their chance. The chance to build a future that was theirs, to create a place that was safe, not just for them, but for the generations that would come after them. "The road ahead will not be easy," Evelyn continued, her voice strong despite the weight of her words. "But we've already proven what we're capable of. Together, we can do anything." The townspeople erupted in applause, a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. It wasn't just applause for her. It was applause for their shared victory, for everything they had survived, for everything they were going to build. As the ceremony drew to a close, Evelyn found herself once again standing alone by the memorial. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of quiet reflection. There had been so much loss, but there had also been so much strength. A voice broke her from her thoughts. "You okay?" It was Rick, walking up beside her. He had always known when she needed space and when she needed someone to talk to. "I'm okay," Evelyn replied, her voice soft. I never imagined it would end like this. It's over. But the work, the rebuilding, it's just beginning." Rick nodded, his eyes reflecting the same understanding that had been in his voice before. "We'll get there. Together." Evelyn looked up at him, a small, grateful smile tugging at her lips. Together. They stood there in silence, side by side, watching the sunset cast its golden glow over Ruby's place. The battle had been won, but this was the beginning of something far more important, the restoration of hope, of home. They had been through hell together, but now they could begin again. In the months that followed, Ruby's place grew stronger, its people more united than ever before. The land began to heal, both physically and emotionally. The pain of the past would never be fully erased, but it was woven into the very fabric of their community, a reminder of what they had overcome and the strength that had carried them through. Evelyn and Rick became the pillars of that strength. They worked side by side with Marcus and the other survivors, creating new systems, forging new alliances, and laying the groundwork for a future built on the lessons they had learned through struggle. They took nothing for granted, knowing the fragility of peace, but also the power of resilience. Ruby's place became a beacon in a world that had known too much darkness, a place where people could come together, rebuild, and hope again. And at the heart of it all stood Evelyn, a woman who had faced the storm and emerged not only unbroken but stronger than ever. The road ahead would not always be easy. There would be challenges, losses, and trials. But they had proven that they could overcome anything as long as they stood together. And that, more than anything, was the true victory. Months had passed since the battle, and Ruby's place had begun to flourish once again. The foundation for a new future was being laid brick by brick, not just through the reconstruction of homes and buildings, but through the revitalization of trust, hope, and community. The war had been brutal, but it had also uncovered a strength in the people of Ruby's place that no one had fully realized before. Evelyn walked through the streets, now quieter and more peaceful, a far cry from the chaos of the previous weeks. Children were playing in the streets, their laughter filling the air. The market was bustling again, vendors calling out to customers as they hawked their goods. There was an energy, a sense of rebirth, that hung in the air. It wasn't perfect. The scars of the past were still fresh, and there were still people grieving, still families working through the trauma of everything they had endured. But as the town slowly rebuilt itself, so too did the people. Evelyn's thoughts often returned to those who had fallen, to the faces she would never see again. It was a pain that would never truly go away. But she had come to realize that their sacrifices had not been in vain. This was the world they had fought for, and she was determined to see it thrive. With the end of the war came new responsibilities for Evelyn. While the work of rebuilding Ruby's place continued, she found herself called to a new role, not just as a leader in battle, but as a guide for the people. The decisions she made now had a far-reaching impact, shaping the future of the town, its laws, and its people. She had always been a fighter, a protector, but now she was also a builder. She sat in on meetings with the council, working closely with Marcus, Rick, and others to ensure that the rebuilding process was done fairly and justly. It wasn't just about fixing what had been broken, but about creating something better than before. There's a lot of rebuilding to be done, not just with the town, but with our way of thinking, Marcus said one day as they sat around a table in the newly reconstructed town hall. We need to rethink our priorities, our resources, our leadership, everything. Evelyn nodded. We have to build something that lasts, not just a place, but a community that works together, where everyone has a voice. Rick, who had been sitting silently at the table, spoke up. And that means we need to ensure we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. No more power-hungry leaders like Victor. We can't let that kind of thing ever happen again. Evelyn looked at her two companions, the weight of their words settling on her shoulders. They were right. The battle against Victor had been about more than just survival. It had been about ensuring that future generations wouldn't face the same struggles. They had to create a system that protected everyone, not just the strong or the powerful. Despite their progress, not all was as smooth as it seemed. As the town rebuilt, a divide began to form. Not everyone agreed with how things should be done. Some people felt that the leadership, especially Evelyn, was moving too slowly. They wanted more immediate changes, more radical shifts in how Ruby's place was run. Others felt that the war had been too costly, and they were ready to leave the area, seeking a fresh start elsewhere. One afternoon, Evelyn stood on the balcony overlooking the town square, watching as a small group of discontented townspeople gathered. They were speaking loudly, some even protesting. It was clear that not everyone shared her vision for Ruby's place's future. Rick joined her on the balcony, his expression troubled. "We knew this wouldn't be easy, but it's getting harder to keep everyone on the same page." "I know," Evelyn said quietly, her gaze following the protesters as they shouted in frustration. "The war might be over, but the battle for unity has just begun." The divide between the factions in the town wasn't just political. It was deeply personal. People had lost loved ones, homes, and their sense of security. For some, the war had been the breaking point, and they were unwilling to wait for things to improve. Others, like Evelyn and her closest allies, believed in the long-term approach that with patience and effort, Ruby's place could be rebuilt into something more sustainable, more inclusive. But with each passing day, the pressure mounted. The cracks in the foundation of Ruby's place's unity were beginning to show, and Evelyn knew she had to act. But how could she bring people together when they were so divided? As Evelyn grappled with these new challenges, she also found herself at a crossroads in her personal life. The bond she shared with Rick had grown even stronger since the battle, but it was clear that both of them had changed. The weight of leadership, the loss they had both endured, had shifted something in them. Rick, ever by her side, had become more than just her partner in battle. He was her equal in every sense. But he was also restless. The demands of rebuilding, of leading a town that was still so fragile, weighed heavily on him as well. One night, after a particularly tense meeting, Rick walked with Evelyn through the town. The air was cool, the stars above twinkling faintly. "You're doing everything you can," he said quietly, his voice filled with both admiration and concern. "But sometimes it feels like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Evelyn glanced at him, her eyes tired but resolute. "I can't stop. Not now. Not after everything we've been through." "I know," Rick said, his gaze distant. "But I wonder, if we keep pushing ourselves this hard, will we ever have a chance to just be us again?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. The truth was, she didn't know. The demands of leadership, the weight of their responsibilities, had consumed her. She had fought for Ruby's place, but she had also lost herself in the process. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "I don't know if I'll ever be the same person again." Rick stopped walking, turning to face her. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. We can still be who we are, together. But you can't keep pushing yourself alone. We're a team. Always have been." Evelyn felt a pang of guilt, but also a surge of warmth. She knew he was right. They had been through so much, and yet, they hadn't been able to take the time to process it all, to rebuild their lives, not just the town. "I don't want to lose you," she said quietly, her voice vulnerable. "You won't," Rick replied, his hand finding hers. "But you have to let me in. Let us all in." The conversation with Rick lingered in Evelyn's mind in the days that followed. She had always believed that leadership meant sacrifice, that she had to bear the burden alone. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to. The journey ahead was still uncertain. Ruby's place was not yet the town it could be, and the people were still healing. But Evelyn was beginning to understand that the true rebuilding wasn't just about stone and mortar. It was about relationships, trust, and community. She wasn't alone in this fight, and neither was Ruby's place. With a renewed sense of purpose, Evelyn stepped back into her role as a leader, not as someone who had all the answers, but as someone who was ready to listen and work alongside those she cared about. Together, they would rebuild, not just a town, but a future. The days following Evelyn's conversation with Rick marked a turning point for Ruby's place. While the town still faced the heavy task of rebuilding, both physically and emotionally, a subtle shift in leadership was beginning to take shape. Evelyn realized that she didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders alone. She had people she could rely on, people who believed in her, and in the vision for a new Ruby's Place. But trust would take time to rebuild, both for her and for the town. The divide that had begun to grow between the factions in the town was still present. Some were still mourning their losses and were unsure whether they could stay in a place that had seen so much destruction. Others felt that the leadership was moving too slowly and wanted immediate action. Evelyn had spent many sleepless nights trying to navigate this new challenge. How could she bring people together when their hopes, fears, and expectations were so different? It was during a town meeting, as the tension between the factions reached a boiling point, that Evelyn realized the only way forward was through open, honest communication. She stood up, her voice calm but firm, as she addressed the crowd. "I know things have been difficult," she began, her words cutting through the murmurs of discontent. "And I know many of you feel like the changes aren't happening fast enough. But I want you to know that we're not ignoring your concerns. We hear you. We feel your pain. And we're all in this together." The room quieted, and for a brief moment, Evelyn saw the vulnerability in the faces of the townspeople. They were afraid, uncertain, and they had every right to be. But she also saw something else: hope. They wanted change. They wanted to see things improve. And she would give them that, but it had to be done the right way. We've all been through a lot. And I won't promise you that everything will be easy. But I do promise you this: we will build a future where everyone has a voice, where everyone has a chance to thrive. It's not going to happen overnight, but it will happen. I believe in this town. I believe in all of you. There was a long silence. Then, slowly, one by one, the townspeople began to nod, their skepticism softening. It was clear they weren't looking for quick fixes. They were looking for a leader who understood their struggles and was willing to walk alongside them. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn made it a point to meet with the leaders of the various factions in Ruby's Place. She sat down with everyone, from the most vocal critics to those who had been on the front lines of the war, listening to their concerns, their hopes, and their ideas for the future. She also spent more time with Rick, leaning on him not just as a partner, but as someone who shared her vision for the future of the town. He had always been her rock, but now more than ever, she needed his support. Together, they began to outline a plan for rebuilding that was rooted in collaboration and shared responsibility. But there was still work to be done, not just rebuilding the town, but rebuilding trust. People had lost faith in the system, in each other. And that wasn't something that could be repaired with speeches or promises. It would take time, patience, and a lot of hard work. One morning, as Evelyn was walking through the market, she saw a group of children playing near the fountain. They were laughing, running around, and for a moment, the weight of the past few months seemed to lift. The future, no matter how uncertain, was right there in front of her, in the eyes of the next generation. She stopped and watched them for a moment, a small smile on her lips. These children, the ones who hadn't yet experienced the horrors of war, would grow up in a different world, a better world. And that was why she fought. That was why she couldn't stop now. Rick found her standing there, watching the children. "You're thinking about the future again, huh?" Evelyn nodded. "Yeah, it's hard not to. We're doing this for them. For all of them." Rick smiled, taking her hand. "We'll get there. It won't be easy, but we've come this far." "I know," Evelyn said, her voice filled with a renewed sense of determination. "We've come too far to stop now." As time went on, the efforts to rebuild Ruby's Place continued. The community began to regain its strength, and the scars of the past started to heal, but there were still challenges. Some people remained hesitant, unwilling to fully trust the changes that were taking place. Others were eager for faster progress, pushing for more drastic reforms. Evelyn found herself balancing the expectations of the townspeople with the reality of what could be accomplished. It was a delicate dance, one that required constant communication, compromise, and patience. But despite the challenges, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the right path. One evening, as she and Rick were walking through the town, they passed a newly built community center. It was a symbol of progress, a place where the people could gather to share ideas, celebrate victories, and support one another. It's coming together, Rick said, his eyes following the people who were gathering inside. Slowly, but it's happening. Evelyn nodded, her heart swelling with pride. Yeah, slowly, but it's happening. It wasn't perfect, and there were still obstacles ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt like they were moving forward, one step at a time. As the months turned into a year, the town of Ruby's Place began to take on a new life. The scars of the past were still visible, but they no longer defined the town. People had started to rebuild their homes, their businesses, and their lives. The market was flourishing again. The streets were filled with people, and the sounds of laughter and conversation had returned. Evelyn had become the leader Ruby's Place needed, not through force or fear, but through her unwavering belief in the strength of the community and her willingness to listen and learn from those around her. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt that hope was more than just a fleeting dream. It was becoming a reality, and as she stood at the edge of Ruby's Place, looking out over the horizon, she knew that the best was yet to come. The sun was just beginning to set as Evelyn walked to the top of the hill overlooking Ruby's Place. The town below was bathed in the soft glow of the evening light, its buildings standing tall and proud against the fading sky. The battle was over. The war had been won. But this was just the beginning. Ruby's Place had been built on sacrifice, on struggle, and on the blood of those who had fought for it. But now it was more than just a town. It was a symbol of resilience, of unity, and of hope. And with that thought, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of peace. She had led her people through the darkest times. Now, it was time to lead them into a brighter future. Together, they would build something that would last, a future worth fighting for. The winds of change had begun to blow gently through Ruby's Place, carrying with them the promise of a new era. As the town continued to rebuild, its heartbeat was no longer defined by the struggle and destruction that had once consumed it. It was defined by unity, by the quiet but powerful resilience of its people. Evelyn had come a long way from the woman who had once walked into the town, uncertain of what the future held. She had fought for Ruby's Place, fought to preserve what little remained after the war, and had built something greater than she could have ever imagined. But even as the foundation of the town solidified, Evelyn understood that the work was far from over. The scars of the past might have been healing, but it was the scars on the hearts of the people that needed tending most. The real challenge, as she now saw it, was making sure the people of Ruby's Place never lost sight of what they had fought for. The peace they had so desperately sought, the community they had painstakingly rebuilt, and the ideals that had driven them to persevere. It was in the early days of spring, when the flowers were beginning to bloom and the air was full of possibility, that the next challenge came. A new group arrived in Ruby's Place, people who had been displaced from other towns, seeking refuge and safety. They had heard of the rebuilding efforts and were eager to start anew. But the arrival of so many newcomers put pressure on the already fragile systems of the town. At first, the people of Ruby's Place welcomed them with open arms, understanding that they too had suffered loss and hardship. But as the days passed, tensions began to rise. Resources, while plentiful compared to what they had been during the war, were still limited. Some began to question whether there would be enough to go around, whether the newcomers would strain the town's fragile economy and community structure. Evelyn, Rick, and the council members had anticipated this issue, but nothing could have prepared them for the growing resentment and fear that began to simmer among the townspeople. Whispers spread through the streets, fueled by uncertainty. They're taking our resources. What if they don't fit in? We fought so hard for this. Why should we share with outsiders? It was the first real test of Ruby's Place's recovery. Could they stay true to the values of inclusion and cooperation that had gotten them this far, or would fear and division tear them apart? Evelyn stood before the council one evening, exhausted and frustrated by the situation. She had been trying to keep the peace, but it was clear that more action was needed. "We can't afford to turn our backs on these people," Evelyn said, her voice unwavering. "We can't forget who we are and what we've been through. We know what it's like to lose everything. We know what it's like to need help. We have to welcome them, just as we were welcomed when we first arrived here, with open arms and open hearts." Rick leaned forward, concern etched on his face. I agree with you, Evelyn. But how do we convince everyone else? There's a lot of fear, and fear can turn into anger very quickly. Evelyn took a deep breath, thinking for a moment. She looked around at the council members, who were silent, uncertain of the next step. We'll have to lead by example, she said at last. We'll invite the newcomers into our homes, into our lives. We'll show them that they're not just here to take, but to contribute. And we'll find ways to share the resources we have, even if it means making sacrifices. The council members nodded, and Evelyn could feel the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that it was the only way forward. Ruby's place had been built on the idea that they were all in this together, and she refused to let fear tear that apart. The following days saw a flurry of activity in Ruby's place. Evelyn and Rick worked tirelessly to bring both the original townspeople and the newcomers together. There were community dinners, shared work projects, and open forums where everyone could voice their concerns and suggestions. Slowly, but surely, the walls that had begun to form between the two groups began to crumble. People began to see each other not as strangers or outsiders, but as fellow survivors, people who had endured hardship and had been given the chance to start anew. One evening, as Evelyn walked through the market, she saw a group of children, both from Ruby's place and from the newly arrived families, playing together, laughing, and sharing toys. The sight brought a rare smile to her lips. It was moments like these, small but powerful, that reminded her of what they were building. Rick joined her, his arm around her shoulders. It's working, he said softly, watching the children. It is, Evelyn agreed, her voice full of pride. But we're not done yet. There's still work to be done. There's always more work to do. Despite the progress, the struggle for balance continued. Ruby's place had become a haven for many, but with that came the pressure of keeping it stable. As the town grew, Evelyn found herself spending more and more time on administrative duties, working with the council, overseeing the allocation of resources, and ensuring that the town's fragile peace was maintained. At times, she felt as though she was losing sight of what had originally driven her. The desire to protect and nurture the people of Ruby's place, to create a place where everyone could belong, no matter their past. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Evelyn sat alone in her office, her head resting in her hands. She was tired, overwhelmed by the weight of her responsibilities. The thought crossed her mind, just for a moment, to leave it all behind, to go somewhere quiet, somewhere where she didn't have to make decisions, didn't have to carry the burden of leadership. But then she thought about the people who depended on her, the children playing in the streets, the families rebuilding their lives. She thought about Ruby's place, about everything they had fought for. She couldn't walk away. She couldn't let fear or exhaustion dictate the course of their future. The work would be hard, and the sacrifices would continue, but she had come too far to turn back now. As the months turned into years, Ruby's place continued to thrive. The town had become a model of resilience and cooperation, a place where people from all walks of life could come together to build something greater than themselves. And in the quiet moments, when the sun set over the hills and the town settled into the peaceful rhythm of everyday life, Evelyn knew that she had created something truly special. The legacy of Ruby's place was not just in the buildings that had been rebuilt or the resources that had been shared. It was in the hearts of the people who called it home. And with that, Evelyn knew that the journey wasn't over. The story of Ruby's place was still being written, and she was just one chapter in a long, ongoing tale of hope, unity, and new beginnings. The morning sun rose over Ruby's place with a promise of new beginnings. The sky, painted in shades of pink and orange, mirrored the town's transformation. Where once there had been only rubble and uncertainty, now stood strong foundations, vibrant community spaces, and streets filled with laughter and activity. The heart of the town, once broken and scarred by conflict, was beating once more. Evelyn stood by the window of her modest office, looking out over the town that had been through so much, that had faced so many trials, and yet here it was, alive, growing, and thriving. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. It had become more than she had ever dreamed it would be. More than a place of survival. It had become a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of resilience and the strength of community. The morning had come for Ruby's Place to take the next step in its journey, and Evelyn knew that the time for her leadership was drawing to a close. It wasn't that she was giving up, far from it. It was simply that the town had grown beyond her, and she knew it was time for new hands to take the reins, to bring fresh perspectives to the challenges ahead. She had spent years guiding the town from the ashes, making countless decisions and sacrifices, but now it was time for the town to thrive on its own. Evelyn had always said that leadership wasn't about power, it was about service. She had given everything she could, and now it was time for the next generation to step forward. And so, with the support of Rick and the town council, Evelyn began the process of passing on her leadership to someone she trusted deeply, Lena, a young woman who had grown up in Ruby's Place and who had become a pillar of strength and wisdom in the community. Lena had witnessed the rise and fall of Ruby's Place from the very beginning. She had seen the town's darkest days, and she had helped rebuild it, brick by brick. She had a fire in her heart, a desire to continue the work Evelyn had started, and most importantly, she had the trust of the people. When Evelyn approached her about becoming the new leader, Lena had been overwhelmed, but she knew it was the right decision. She was ready. The day of the ceremony was filled with emotion. The townspeople gathered in the town square, where a simple stage had been set up. The soft hum of voices filled the air as people took their seats, waiting for the moment they had been anticipating, the official passing of the torch. Evelyn stood at the front of the crowd, her heart full. Beside her was Lena, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes resolute. She looked at Evelyn with gratitude, but also with a deep understanding of the responsibility that was now hers. Evelyn took a deep breath before stepping forward to address the crowd. Ruby's Place is a place of survival. Yes, she began, her voice steady, but her emotions clear. But it is also a place of hope, of unity, and of love. We've been through so much together, and we've come out the other side stronger. Today, I stand here not to say goodbye, but to say thank you. Thank you for believing in me, thank you for fighting alongside me, and thank you for making Ruby's Place what it is today. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the square. Evelyn smiled through her tears, but her eyes were fixed on Lena, who was watching her with a mixture of awe and determination. Evelyn continued, "And now, it is time for the next chapter. It is time for Ruby's Place to grow, to evolve, to thrive in ways that I can no longer guide. I am proud to introduce to you the new leader of Ruby's Place, Lena." Lena stepped forward, the crowd's applause swelling, and Evelyn placed her hand on Lena's shoulder, a silent gesture of trust and belief. Lena took the microphone, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I stand here today not because I am the best or the brightest, but because I am one of you. I grew up in Ruby's Place, I have fought for it, and I will continue to fight for it. I will lead with love, with integrity, and with the understanding that we are stronger together than we could ever be apart. Together, we will face whatever challenges lie ahead, and we will build a future that is worthy of the sacrifices we've all made." The crowd's applause was deafening, a resounding affirmation of Lena's leadership and the unity of the town. For a moment, Evelyn allowed herself to simply stand there, to breathe in the moment, to savor the success they had all worked so hard for. As the ceremony came to a close, Evelyn stepped down from the stage and made her way to the outskirts of the crowd, where Rick was waiting for her. He smiled at her, his eyes warm with pride. "You did it," he said simply. Evelyn smiled back, a sense of peace washing over her. "No, we did it," she corrected him. "All of us." Rick took her hand, and together, they walked toward the edge of town. They stood there for a moment, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets of Ruby's Place. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Evelyn said, her voice soft. "We have," Rick agreed, his gaze on the town. "And it's all thanks to you." Evelyn shook her head, a modest smile on her lips. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone. Every person who fought, who rebuilt, who believed." As the two of them stood there, the sound of children's laughter, the clink of tools in the distance, and the low murmur of people coming together to continue their work filled the air. Ruby's Place wasn't just a town anymore. It was a family. It was a community. And that, Evelyn knew, was her greatest legacy. The road ahead would not always be easy, but as long as they stayed together, as long as they kept fighting for each other, Ruby's place would continue to thrive. And with that thought, Evelyn knew that the town she had helped rebuild was in good hands.